In the middle of the 9th century, a noblewoman from Kent named Ealberg made a generous donation to the monastery of St. Augustine in Canterbury. From her estate at Brabourne, she arranged for the monks to receive a yearly delivery of goods: a bullock, 4 sheep, 20 hens, 240 loaves of bread, a load of lard, a load of cheese, 40 measures of malt, and 4 cartloads of wood. In exchange, the religious community promised to include prayers for Ealberg and her husband, Ealdred, in their daily devotions. This donation is part of a remarkable group of 9th century records that reveal the deep piety and active involvement of local aristocrats in religious life, particularly in Kent. These documents show how noble families gave gifts to favored churches, exchanged land, made petitions to the king, prepared for pilgrimages abroad, supported the poor, and tried to secure their salvation through acts of generosity. Written in the local language, they offer a rare glimpse into a world often hidden behind the more formal Latin records of the time. In these texts, women like Ealberg appear not just as witnesses, but as active landowners and donors, participating in religious and social affairs alongside their male relatives. Ealberg's family held considerable influence in the region and appears frequently in the records, especially in connection with the Cathedral Church of Christ Church, Canterbury. Her estate at Brabourne was located near the foot of the North Downs, a short day's journey from Canterbury along an old Roman road. Her family's power base lay in southern and eastern Kent. Her brother Ealhir owned land at Fingalsham, while another brother, Ethelmod, held land at Little Chart. Ealberg herself possessed another estate at Bishopsbourne, reinforcing the prominence of her lineage. Her donation to St. Augustine's was part of an established tradition of lay religious patronage and belonged to a wider pattern of family-based support for religious institutions. Yet one clause in her gift reflects the changing times and growing instability. If, due to fear and chaos caused by heathen invasions, the agreed goods could not be delivered, the following year's payment would be doubled. If 3 consecutive years passed without any delivery, the estate itself would be transferred permanently to the monastery. The threat she referred to came from the Vikings, who had begun raiding the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in the late 8th century. By the 9th century, their attacks had grown more frequent and destructive. By the late 800s and 70s, Viking forces had brought most of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under their control. Ealberg's own family had already suffered loss. Her brother Ealhir died in battle against the Vikings in 853 and may have already been dead when she made her grant. The presence of the Vikings dominates both contemporary records and modern interpretations of this era. The near-complete collapse of Anglo-Saxon power at their hands casts a long shadow over the 9th century, encouraging the view that decline was inevitable. But while the Vikings were a persistent and deadly threat, their most serious impact did not come until the arrival of a major invasion force in the 860s. Even then, daily life continued in many places. Despite the dangers, Ealberg's estate appears to have maintained its yearly obligations to St. Augustine's without major interruption, even as Viking activity surged in Kent. Her donation illustrates how people had to make adjustments in response to growing uncertainty. Within the terms of her grant, one can see both continuity and adaptation, traditional religious practices carried out with an eye on new threats. Though the Viking raids left a deep imprint on the 9th century, they were not the sole cause of change. The developments of the period were driven by a mixture of external pressures and internal transformations. the world that the Vikings encountered in the 860s and 870s had already evolved significantly from the one they had first attacked decades earlier. From the mid-820s, the long-standing dominance of Mercia in southern England began to fade, making way for the rising power of Wessex. West Saxon rulers expanded their reach along both the eastern and western shores, taking control of regions like Sussex, Kent, and Essex, while solidifying their hold over Devon and pushing deeper into Cornwall. Other kingdoms, such as East Anglia and Northumbria, offered submission, and Mercia itself briefly fell under direct West Saxon control. By the mid-9th century, Wessex had extended its rule over nearly all territories south of the Thames and even beyond the River Lea. Under King Alfred's leadership, this enlarged Wessex managed to withstand the Viking onslaughts and conquests that defined the later decades of the century. While Wessex remained largely intact, the rest of the political map was permanently reshaped. Viking control spread across East Anglia, the East Midlands, and Northumbria, extinguishing native dynasties in these regions. Though the West Saxon kings would gradually reclaim much of this territory during the 10th century, the Viking presence left lasting effects on local language, culture, and society. Alongside these political changes, the economy of the Anglo-Saxon world underwent major shifts. The once thriving trade hubs, known as emporia, that had driven commerce in earlier centuries began to decline. As these centers faded, many smaller markets and production sites linked to them also disappeared. By the end of the century, the economic and administrative heart of England had shifted to a network of fortified towns established by King Alfred. These strongholds, later known as burhs, played both a military and civic role. Over time, they became central to governance, economic activity, and cultural development during the later Anglo-Saxon period. Writers from the Anglo-Saxon period were especially struck by the religious and intellectual changes that unfolded during the 9th century. In the 890s, King Alfred expressed deep concern over the state of education and the fading of learning across southern England. A generation later, monastic reformers of the 10th century would seek to restore a church they believed had been weakened by the greed of kings and nobles and by the destruction caused by Viking attacks. However, much of what we know about these dramatic changes comes from Wessex and reflects the West Saxon point of view. The most important source for this period is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a text likely compiled at King Alfred's court in the 890s. Its focus lies firmly on the rise of Wessex and the lineage to which Alfred belonged, shaping its version of events around the political victories of Wessex and its responses to the Viking threat. The chronicle does not show open hostility toward other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, perhaps because Alfred's court was known for its inclusivity. But the affairs of regions like Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia receive little attention. Northumbria's loss of York to the Vikings in 867 is briefly mentioned, but otherwise its fate is largely ignored. Even events closer to home are missing. Major Viking attacks, such as the one on Southampton in 842 or the raids across Britain in 844, are not included. Likewise, some of Alfred's own military campaigns, known through charters, go unrecorded. Other sources, both written and archaeological, help complete the picture and sometimes challenge the chronicle's version of events. Coins, ruins, and objects of daily life reveal patterns of economic and social development often overlooked in written records. Still, much of this evidence is interpreted through the lens of West Saxon influence, and the narrative that originated in Alfred's court remains the dominant one when it comes to understanding the 9th century. One of the earliest encounters with Vikings recorded in the Chronicle took place during the reign of King Beorhtric. 3 Danish ships landed on the coast near Portland, and a royal official named Biduhord went to meet them, expecting they were traders required to pay tolls. But he was mistaken, and the Danes killed him. The chronicle marked this as a historic moment, the first arrival of Viking ships in England. That early attack had little immediate impact. It was the 793rd raid on the monastery at Lindisfarne that sent shockwaves throughout the Christian world. According to one version of the chronicle, a series of terrifying omens, lightning, whirlwinds, and fire-breathing dragons preceded the event. On June 8th, the monastery was looted by Viking raiders, a moment of such horror that it resonated far beyond England. At the court of Charlemagne, the Northumbrian scholar Alcuin was deeply disturbed by the news. In letters to friends and leaders in Northumbria, he described the desecration of holy ground and the bloodshed that had taken place. Alcuin turned to biblical language to explain the catastrophe, framing it as both a divine punishment and a warning to the church and nobility. In his view, the sins of the people, ranging from greed to vanity, had brought this disaster upon them. Yet Alcuin did not stop at moral judgment. He also looked for ways to assist, hoping Charlemagne might intervene to help those captured during the attack. Although there had long been trade and contact between Scandinavia and the Anglo-Saxon world, the violence of the Lindisfarne raid felt unprecedented. Alcuin even criticized Northumbrian nobles for adopting Scandinavian fashions, but the scale and nature of the assault took many by surprise. The following year saw another Viking attack, this time further inland in Northumbria, where a monastery at the mouth of the river Don was plundered. Other sites, such as Hartness and Tynemouth, may also have been targeted by the year 800. Yet after this flurry of activity, the chronicle remains largely silent on Viking raids until 835, when they struck the Isle of Sheppey. From then on, Viking attacks appear almost every year in the record. These attacks were part of a much broader Scandinavian movement during the 8th to 11th centuries. To the west, Norse explorers and settlers expanded into Britain, Ireland, and surrounding islands, even reaching as far as the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and eventually the shores of North America. On the European mainland, Viking forces launched attacks deep into the Frankish Empire and beyond, eventually securing territory that would become known as Normandy. In the east, they established far-reaching trade routes through the Baltic and into what is now Russia and Ukraine, connecting with the Caspian and Black Seas, and extending influence into the Byzantine world and the Middle East. The word Viking has come to encompass all Scandinavian activities from this period, and the age itself is often referred to as the Viking Age. Yet the term still carries a strong association with violence, which can be misleading. Not all Norse ventures were marked by warfare. Since the mid-20th century, scholars have increasingly emphasized the contributions of Scandinavians to trade, cultural exchange, and the shaping of early medieval Europe. Much of their fearsome image comes from Christian accounts, as the Vikings themselves left few written records. Whether or not the Vikings were particularly brutal remains a matter of debate. What is clear, however, is that the late 8th century ushered in a new and often turbulent phase in European history. The Norse engaged in a wide range of activities: exploration, commerce, raiding, conquest, and settlement, spreading their influence across vast distances. Trying to reduce all of this to a single explanation would be futile. But it's evident that their expansion was linked to broader economic and political trends. The growing wealth of certain regions in northwestern Europe likely attracted Viking attention. Trade had flourished, and portable riches became more accessible. Through growing contact with the continent, Norsemen learned about vulnerable areas, valuable resources, and internal disputes they could exploit to their advantage. Interestingly, the earliest raids did not target the major trading ports, which would later become frequent victims. Instead, churches and monasteries bore the brunt of these initial assaults. Though some of these places played roles in commerce, they were often isolated and poorly defended. To the Christian observers, the attacks were sacrilegious outrages, but to the Vikings, these institutions represented opportunity, storehouses of wealth, easy targets, and sources of high-status prisoners. Even sacred books could become bargaining chips, as shown by the ransom of the illuminated manuscript known today as the Stockholm Codex Aureus. By the end of the 8th century, the growing wealth of northwestern Europe became an increasingly attractive target for Viking raiders. But internal changes within Scandinavia were also a driving force behind this expansion. Political structures in Scandinavia were becoming more centralized, which brought about intense struggles for power among rival dynasties. Securing or challenging authority in this environment required substantial wealth, both to reward loyal warriors and to engage in the exchange of valuable gifts that enhanced status and influence. While trade offered one means of acquiring such wealth, raiding provided another, often more direct, opportunity. Some members of rival dynasties who were excluded from power may have been pushed into exile, seeking to carve out territories abroad, while others may have left voluntarily to build new power bases from which they could later return to challenge rivals at home. The Viking raids of the early 9th century, therefore, took place within a context of profound political shifts, both in Scandinavia and in England. The death of King Cenwulf in 821 marked the beginning of the decline of Mercian dominance, which had lasted for nearly a century. Though Mercia remained a powerful kingdom for several decades, its supremacy was steadily eroded. By the close of the 9th century, the kingdom had been divided by Viking conquests, and what remained under Anglo-Saxon control had fallen under the overlordship of Wessex. During the middle years of the 9th century, Wessex rose to a position of preeminence, taking the lead role in resisting the Viking threat and unifying the southern English kingdoms. Even contemporaries saw Cenwulf's death as a turning point. A charter from 825 mentions that his passing was followed by unrest, disputes between kings and bishops, and the seizure of church lands. Cenwulf's brother, Ceolwulf, succeeded him, but reigned only briefly. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle states that Ceolwulf was deprived of his throne in 823, though details of the event remain unclear. Nevertheless, he was able to preserve much of Cenwulf's southern dominance during his short rule. After Cenwulf's death, East Anglia appears to have made a brief attempt at independence, but Mercia soon reasserted control. Similarly, Ceolwulf's position in Kent may initially have been insecure, but by 822 he had strengthened his authority and was consecrated king by Archbishop Wulfrid of Canterbury. He also continued Mercian traditions of military activity, conducting campaigns in Wales that included the destruction of Deganwy in the north and an invasion of Powys in the east. Despite these continuities, Ceolwulf's brief reign and sudden fall hint at deeper problems within Mercia. His removal in 823 triggered further turmoil, including the killing of prominent ealdormen such as Berghelm and Mucha, key figures in his regime. By 825, the cracks in Mercian power were widening. According to the chronicle, the East Angles, fearing Mercian dominance, sought protection from Ecgbert of Wessex. In the same year, Mercia suffered a major defeat against Wessex at the Battle of Rotten, resulting in the loss of Kent. Ceolwulf's successor, Beornwulf, was soon killed in East Anglia. 2 years later, in 827, Beornwulf's successor, Ludeka, also met his death. While later accounts claim he died during a retaliatory campaign in East Anglia, it is equally possible that internal disputes within Mercia were to blame. Coin evidence suggests Ludeka briefly ruled East Anglia, but whatever the case, by the late 820s, East Anglia had reasserted its independence and was minting coins solely in the name of its own rulers. The ability of East Anglia to maintain its independence against both Mercian and West Saxon encroachment is, in itself, evidence of its growing strength. The breakdown of Mercian hegemony during this period forced its kings to adopt new strategies for securing loyalty and rewarding allies. Grants of land were increasingly replaced by exemptions from royal rights, or by exchanges that required payment. For example, in 866, King Burgred granted land at Seckley in Worcestershire to a nobleman named Wulford, but only in return for a lifetime lease of a larger estate, a payment of 400 silver coins, and a variety of livestock and crops. Several charters from this period also mention the seizure of church lands by Mercian kings, which were later redistributed among their supporters. Another hallmark of Mercian politics in the 9th century was dynastic instability. Apart from Cenwulf, and possibly Bertwulf, few rulers were succeeded by close relatives. Instead, the recurrence of certain names suggests at least 3 competing dynasties struggling for power. The so-called C dynasty included Cenwulf, Ceolwulf, and their brother Cuthred, who ruled Kent as a sub-king. The B dynasty probably comprised Beornwulf, Bertwulf, and Burgred, while the W, or Whig, dynasty was represented by King Wiglaf, though its members remained influential throughout this period. Despite its declining power, Mercia continued to play a key role in English politics and diplomacy. In 853, Ethelswith, daughter of the West Saxon king Ethelwulf, married King Burgred of Mercia, strengthening ties between the two kingdoms. In 868, Alfred, future king of Wessex, married Ealhswith, daughter of the Mercian noble Ethelred Musil. Mercia also maintained connections with the continent. A charter from 848 for the monastery of Bredon-on-the-Hill records obligations to host envoys not only from Northumbria and Wessex, but also from overseas. Mercian influence, or at least ambitions, in Wales also persisted. In 853, Burgred sought the assistance of Wessex in a successful campaign to subdue the Welsh. Although Mercia continued to exert influence in the early 9th century, it was Wessex that steadily emerged as the dominant Anglo-Saxon kingdom. In 802, Ecgbert secured the throne of Wessex, founding a royal line that would eventually oversee the unification of England and maintain its hold until the Norman conquest in 1066. The early years of Ecgbert's reign remain poorly documented, but his attention soon turned toward expansion in the west. In 815, records describe his forces devastating Cornwall from east to west. A decade later, in 825, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recounts a battle at Galford between men from Devon and Cornish forces, and a separate record from the same year mentions a campaign by Ecgbert against the Britons, most likely meaning the Cornish, at a place called Criodantreo. That year also saw a significant conflict with Mercia at Rotten in Wiltshire, where Ecgbert achieved a decisive victory, reportedly resulting in a heavy loss of life for the enemy. Following this success, Ecgbert dispatched an army into Kent, led by his son Ethelwulf, Bishop Ilstan of Sherborne, and Ealdorman Wulfherd. They drove out King Bealdred, likely a Mercian-backed ruler, and received the submission of Kent, Surrey, Sussex, and Essex. While West Saxon sources portray this as a swift conquest, evidence such as a Kentish charter from 826 referencing Beornwulf of Mercia suggests that Mercian control lingered briefly. Nevertheless, the broader picture reveals a sweeping collapse in the south. In 829, Ecgbert went further by removing Wiglaf from the Mercian throne and ruling Mercia himself. He then marched north to Dore, where the Northumbrians formally submitted to him. At this moment, Ecgbert stood at the height of his power. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle marked the occasion by naming him among the most powerful rulers of Anglo-Saxon England and bestowing upon him the title Breitenwalda, which can be translated as mighty ruler or wide ruler. This term, though debated in modern scholarship, seems to have been a celebratory phrase meant to underscore the extent of Ecgbert's supremacy at that time. In 830, Ecgbert led a campaign into Wales, where he reportedly brought the Welsh to heel. Yet, even as his power reached its peak, Mercia began to recover. That same year, Wiglaf returned to the throne. While he appears in later documents as a respected and autonomous king, certain signs suggest that his authority was diminished compared to his earlier reign. No new coins were issued in his name after 829, or if they were, they represented only a brief and limited run. This might reflect Mercia's reduced economic base or a narrower territorial control. It remains unclear whether Wiglaf reclaimed power by resisting Wessex directly or by exploiting West Saxon overextension, and a peaceful settlement cannot be ruled out. Regardless, relations between the two kingdoms seemed to stabilize in the following years. In fact, cooperation increased, and territories like Berkshire were peacefully transferred from Mercian to West Saxon control, even maintaining their Mercian governors, such as Ealdorman Ethelwulf. The extent to which Northumbria remained subject to Wessex after the events of 829 is uncertain. The historical record for this region during this time is sparse, and its rulers are known mainly by name. Unlike the volatile politics of the previous century, Northumbrian kingship in the 9th century appears more stable, likely dominated by a single dynasty with strong continental ties. King Eardwulf, for instance, was exiled in 806 and sought support from both Charlemagne and Pope Leo III. Surviving letters reveal a diplomatic effort involving the emperor, the pope, and figures like Cenwulf of Mercia and Archbishop Eanbald of York. Eardwulf eventually returned to Northumbria, possibly regaining his throne with the help of Frankish and papal envoys. These ties may have strengthened the rule of Eardwulf's son, Eanred, whose reign reportedly lasted over 30 years, an unusually long tenure that is partly supported by surviving coin evidence. Although little else is known about Eanred's rule, it seems likely that he led the submission to Ecgbert at Dore in 829. This moment may also be linked to the minting of a rare silver penny found at Trewhiddle, which closely resembles coins from southern England, perhaps indicating it was part of a diplomatic offering or tribute to Wessex. While the chronicle does not mention such a tribute, later sources do, and it would not be surprising given the context. After the 820s, Northumbria found itself drawn into power struggles, not only with the southern kingdoms, but also with northern rivals. According to a later Scottish chronicle, Kenneth MacAlpin, who became king of Dal Riata in 840, launched repeated attacks on Northumbria, burning towns like Dunbar and Melrose. These attacks may have been part of his larger campaign to conquer Pictavia, and some medieval sources claim the Northumbrians supported the Picts against him. For much of the period leading up to the Viking invasion in the 860s, however, the internal political history of Northumbria remains largely unknown. If Wessex continued to assert any authority over the north, the record is silent. It seems likely that the Northumbrian submission to Ecgbert in 829 was a temporary event, and that significant West Saxon influence in the north would not re-emerge until the early 10th century. Even though Wessex's influence over Northumbria and Mercia may have fluctuated, its control over Kent, Surrey, Sussex, and Essex remained firm. This dominance endured through the turbulent period of Viking incursions later in the 9th century and eventually provided the foundation for the formation of a unified Kingdom of England. After Ecgbert's reign, his son Ethelwulf took the throne, followed in succession by Ethelwulf's sons, Ethelbald, Ethelbert, Ethelred, and Alfred. It was Alfred's grandson, Ethelstan, who would ultimately become the first monarch to rule all the English people from 927 to 939. The strength of West Saxon rule proved to be more lasting than the earlier dominance once held by Mercia. One possible reason for this endurance lies in how the two kingdoms were governed. While ealdormen, regional officials with administrative, judicial, and military responsibilities, were present across the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the systems behind them varied significantly. In Mercia, many ealdormen seem to have represented distinct ethnic or political groups, perhaps as descendants of former rulers or as leaders of semi-independent tribes. Examples like Hunbert of the Tomset or Ethelred of the Gaini suggest that Mercian governance was based more on alliances among peoples than on a centralized state. The Mercian king, in this context, may have been more a first among equals than a centralizing authority. In contrast, the structure in Wessex was more hierarchical and tightly controlled. Ealdormen in Wessex operated more as appointed royal administrators, executing the king's will in specific regions. While some West Saxon shires had once been independent kingdoms, others were administrative creations centered around royal strongholds, for instance, Dorchester in Dorset and Wilton in Wiltshire. This organization reflected a more centralized and cohesive form of rule, with the king and his court serving as the clear core of governance. Beneath the ealdormen was another crucial layer of royal agents known as thegns or ministers. These men fulfilled various functions. Some managed royal estates as reeves, others fought as part of the king's personal guard, and many worked directly within the royal household, overseeing tasks from serving wine to guarding royal treasures. These positions offered not only close proximity to the king, but also prestige and influence. In Wessex, these ministers played a particularly prominent role, and many later became ealdormen themselves. One example is Aethelmod, who began his career serving Ethelwulf as a steward, and later rose to govern Kent. The noble class from which these officials were drawn was both closely knit and broadly inclusive. This arrangement helped ensure that all major families shared in the benefits of power, discouraging rebellion and making the competition among nobles more about gaining influence at court than seizing the throne. The rulers of Wessex also employed a more hands-on approach in managing newly conquered regions compared to their Mercian predecessors. While the Mercian kings had governed places like Kent from a distance and sidelined local elites, the kings of Wessex integrated regional nobles into their administration and visited these areas more frequently. This included promoting Kentish families, like that of Ealdburg, into positions of power. Ecgbert also forged a critical alliance with Archbishop Ceolnoth of Canterbury to secure his son Ethelwulf's succession. Their agreement gave monasteries the option to seek royal protection while confirming the bishop's spiritual authority over them. This effectively resolved long-standing conflicts over monastic control in Kent. Wessex also retained the practice of installing sub-kings in its eastern regions. Ecgbert and Ethelwulf appointed their sons to rule over territories like Kent and Sussex. Ethelwulf even seems to have envisioned dividing his realm into two related kingdoms, Wessex in the west and a separate eastern kingdom. However, the early deaths of his first two sons led to a reunification of these regions under Ethelbert in 860, an act made possible with the consent of his brothers Ethelred and Alfred. The eventual creation of a cohesive Greater Wessex, stretching along England's southern coast, thus owed much to a mixture of strategic planning, dynastic misfortune, and the growing need for unity in response to intensifying Viking threats. Meanwhile, the economic conditions that had once supported Mercian dominance were beginning to shift. During the mid-9th century, the amount of coinage circulating in the southern kingdoms dropped sharply. This decline may signal broader economic adjustments. Northumbria, by contrast, saw a surge in coin production, though at the cost of quality. Its kings began to heavily debase the currency after the reign of Eanred, producing coins of significantly lower metal content. While such debasement might seem like a sign of decline, it could have been a deliberate move to enable widespread low-value trade. As a result, Northumbrian coinage became more abundant, with coins found even south of the Humber in places like East Anglia and Lincolnshire, suggesting their practical utility was recognized beyond the kingdom itself. Fluctuations in coin production don't offer a straightforward measure of economic prosperity, and there's no clear sign that the Anglo-Saxon world became notably poorer during the 9th century. In fact, the period is rich in archaeological finds of fine metalwork. Silver strap ends decorated with intricate patterns and other high-quality items of jewelry are frequently uncovered from this time. Legal documents also reference considerable holdings of silver and bullion, reinforcing the impression of continued wealth. Still, the changing patterns in coin use do suggest that economic behavior and systems of exchange were evolving. Nowhere was this transformation more visible than in the trading towns known as emporia. In London, the settlement of Lundenwich, located near the present-day Strand, had already begun to shrink in the late 8th century. Excavations at the site, particularly near the Royal Opera House in Covent Garden, show a marked decline in new construction after around 770. Buildings fell into disrepair, alleyways were neglected, and the main road through the site wasn't resurfaced in the 9th century. Though some lanes continued to be maintained for a while, others were eventually turned into refuse dumps. Craft and industrial work didn't vanish entirely, but continued on a smaller scale. Archaeologists have found remains of smithing hearths, scrap metal, loom weights, spindle whorls, and even sword fittings, pointing to ongoing, though reduced, production of high-status goods. Tanning activities ceased, with the pits being abandoned and the land repurposed for waste. Textile production persisted, as loom weights and spindles were found throughout the site, but again at reduced intensity. A shift in trade routes also seems to have occurred during this period. Evidence from pottery shows that goods from Ipswich became more common, and there was an increasing emphasis on trade with the Rhineland, rather than with the southern regions that had previously dominated commerce. In the early 9th century, a large defensive ditch, over 55 meters in length, was constructed at the northern boundary of the site, cutting through several earlier structures that had already fallen into disuse. Similar ditches have been identified in other parts of Lundenwich during separate excavations, including those at Maiden Lane and Bruce House. These findings suggest the possibility that Lundenwic was once enclosed, with a ditch to the north and the river forming a natural boundary to the south. By the mid-9th century, however, the area had been mostly abandoned and returned to agricultural use. Attention shifted instead to the region within and around the old Roman walls, further downstream, which would become the new center of Anglo-Saxon London. This transition also affected nearby locations, such as the elite complex at Whitehall, which was likewise abandoned during the same period. Though the timelines differ slightly, similar transformations were occurring at other trading hubs. At Hamwick, known today as Southampton, building activity ceased after the mid-9th century, and the site experienced a steady decline before being almost entirely deserted by the end of the century. Urban life then concentrated in the more defensible area nearby, which evolved into later medieval Southampton. In York, trade and activity outside the Roman walls continued into the 10th century, but even here, the 840s saw a shift from the established site at Fishergate to alternative areas. Only Ipswich showed sustained activity throughout this period. New construction took place in the late 9th and 10th centuries, and the local mint increased its production, accounting for a substantial portion of coin finds from south of the Humber. During this time, East Anglia became the most monetized kingdom in the south, apart from Northumbria. Although some foreign coins circulated there, the majority of the finds by the mid-9th century were locally minted, indicating a distinctive and internally focused economy. Despite the relative continuity at Ipswich, changes in production methods still occurred. Around 850, the production of the region's characteristic Ipswich ware pottery came to an end, and a new type, Thetford ware, began to be manufactured in the same town. However, this new pottery had a more limited distribution and was initially produced on a smaller scale, reflecting broader changes in economic and craft practices. Smaller trading sites and local production centers were affected too. At Sandtun in West Hythe, Kent, activity at this seasonal manufacturing site declined sharply in the later 9th century. Finds of pottery, coins, and metalwork dwindled, and by the century's end, the site was almost entirely deserted. A similar pattern is evident at other rich archaeological sites. At Cotham in East Yorkshire, material linked to a southern enclosure vanishes by the mid-9th century, and attention shifts to the northern part of the site, where a new fortified complex with a rampart and probable gatehouse was built. This location remained active for another 50 years before focus moved again to the nearby deserted villages of Cotham and Cowlham. In Norfolk, Wormegay experienced comparable transitions, with its productive phase replaced by a short-lived enclosure complex. Some sites, like the one near Carisbrooke on the Isle of Wight, were abandoned entirely, while others, such as those at Congham and Rudham, continued into the later period, but likely evolved in their function. The disappearance of these once vibrant centers appears to reflect a broader reorganization of rural society. Throughout the Middle Saxon period, settlement locations shifted, and by the later Anglo-Saxon period, the layout and function of settlements had changed substantially. At Bidford-on-Avon, for example, activity at a productive site ceased around the same time as nearby communities relocated. The developments at Cotham and Wormegay suggest the emergence of new types of elite residences, serving not only as dwellings, but also as hubs for local governance and trade. These were probably homes of the lesser nobility, yet by the late 9th century, more elaborate sites were being constructed. One such site at Golthoe in Lincolnshire replaced earlier farmsteads with a large enclosure measuring 48 by 48 meters, surrounded by a rampart and ditch. Inside stood a range of buildings, including a grand hall for public gatherings, a private chamber for the lord and his family, a weaving shed, a separate kitchen with a clay floor, and a latrine pit. It is tempting to view the Viking raids as the main driver of these widespread changes. Indeed, Viking attacks are documented in London in 842 and 851, and in Hamwick in 840 and 842. The defensive ditch at Lundenwich might well have been constructed in response to this threat. Elsewhere in Europe, Viking raids devastated major trading towns like Quentivik in northern France and Dorestad in the Netherlands. Maritime trade routes would have been especially vulnerable, and Viking fleets had already been active in the English Channel since the late 8th century. In fact, Offa of Mercia had taken steps to protect the coasts of Kent and Sussex from such threats. Around the same time, Charlemagne assembled a naval force to defend the northern coast of his empire. The risks were real. Aldwulf, a papal representative returning from Britain, was captured by pirates and released only after a ransom was paid by one of King Kenwulf's men. Still, Viking activity alone does not explain the full picture. The decline of the Emporia appears to have begun before the Viking raids intensified. Fires in London in 764, 798, and 801 are known to have caused substantial damage and may have prompted the retrenchment of trading activity. In Dorestad, environmental changes, including shifting rivers and sea levels, likely played a role in its decline. Competition from smaller trading settlements nearby may also have contributed, some of which would later become new urban centers. The interconnected nature of these commercial hubs means that the weakening of one may have undermined others. In this context, the Vikings may have delivered the final blow to systems that were already faltering. In response to these disruptions, Anglo-Saxon rulers made efforts to revitalize commerce. Between 844 and 852, King Bertwulf of Mercia confirmed a toll exemption at London that had been granted more than a century earlier to the bishopric of Rochester. In 857, his successor, Burgred, granted a profitable plot of land near the west gate of London to Bishop Ealhun of Worcester. Alongside the land, the bishop received rights to use scales and measures freely within the port. These actions suggest that the Mercian kings were attempting to re-establish trade at a new location within London, away from the declining Lundenwic. This shift likely took place inside the Roman walls, with privileges extended to signal continuity and attract renewed economic activity to the redefined urban center. During the reign of Bertwulf, the mint in London was reactivated after a pause during the final years of Wiglaf's rule. The first coins issued under Bertwulf appear to have relied on expertise from the mint at Rochester. It is likely that either coin dies were brought from Rochester, or experienced moneyers were relocated to London, indicating that Mercia may have lacked the necessary skilled labor at that time. However, this revival was short-lived, as the mint fell into decline again and remained largely inactive until it was revived once more in the 860s under King Burgred. It was during this later period that a joint coinage system was introduced for both Mercia and Wessex. This lunette-style coinage was initially produced for Burgred in London, but soon it was also minted under the authority of the West Saxon king at Mints in Wessex. While the motivation for this collaboration remains unclear, it may have been an attempt to establish a unified currency zone to encourage economic stability and growth. Despite the waning influence of the Emporia during the 9th century, there are clear signs that urban life continued to thrive in other areas of Anglo-Saxon England. The most detailed evidence comes from Canterbury, where records preserved in the Christ Church archive provide exceptional insight into daily life in the city. The eastern part of Canterbury, within the old city walls, featured a network of narrow streets lined with burgage plots. Charters from the period mention a bylaw requiring a 2-foot gap between buildings to allow rainwater to drain, evidence of dense urban construction and limited space. Many of these plots had additional agricultural land outside the city walls, significantly increasing their value compared to rural estates. There was also an active market for these properties, reflecting a vibrant real estate economy. The western section of the city, by contrast, was more rural in character, likely due to its vulnerability to flooding. Larger landholdings in this area were often in the hands of religious institutions. By the 9th century, the residents of Canterbury were already organized into various guilds and fraternities. One such group was the Guild of Neatus, possibly urban stewards or property managers working on behalf of prominent landowners. Another, more enigmatic group was the Fraternity of Michael Gemetan, which may have comprised poorer residents who shared food or depended on others for sustenance. Other categories of urban dwellers included the inner and outer burgesses, some residing within the city walls, and others just beyond, in the surrounding area. Canterbury's unique position as a royal and ecclesiastical center since the early 7th century may explain the exceptional nature of its urban life. It was also home to the most prolific and economically significant mint in southern Britain, accounting for nearly half of all coin finds in the region. As cities like Lundenwic and Hamwic declined, Canterbury's prominence in the southern economy became even more pronounced. Although Canterbury stood out, signs of urban revival can be found elsewhere. In Rochester, some areas were likely divided into burgage plots by the middle of the 9th century. The city's growth may have been influenced by its status as an episcopal seat and the presence of a small mint. At Winchester, an early 10th century poem credits Bishop Swithin with constructing a bridge outside the East Gate around 859. This may have been intended to improve access to the town and support growing trade. By the early 10th century, this road had become Winchester's main market street. Swithin's bridge might have been part of a broader redevelopment effort led by the bishop and King Ethelbald of Wessex, possibly in response to the fading importance of Hamwic. While the full extent of this redevelopment is uncertain, it is likely that most of Winchester's street grid was established later in the century. It remains unclear whether this urban growth was a new development in the 9th century or a continuation of earlier trends. However, Viking raids likely made walled towns more attractive, with the high value of urban properties possibly reflecting the security they offered. In 804, the community at Lyminge was granted land in Canterbury to serve as a refuge, and a similar arrangement may have been made for the monastery at Minster in Thanet. It is also worth noting that the earliest West Saxon charters requiring fortress construction date from the 850s. By the end of the 9th century, King Alfred reflected on a time of material wealth but spiritual and intellectual decline. He lamented that, although churches and monasteries were full of precious books, they were of little use, as very few people south of the Thames could read Latin or understand the liturgy. Even north of the Thames, the situation was not much better. This bleak picture was echoed by Alfred's biographer, Asser, who claimed that although there were many monasteries in Wessex, few followed proper monastic discipline. He blamed this partly on Viking disruptions and partly on the corrupting influence of wealth. Concerns about the state of the church were shared beyond Britain as well. Archbishop Fulco of Reims, writing to Alfred in the 880s, lamented the breakdown of church councils and synods in Anglo-Saxon England. There is ample evidence to support such assessments. Between 835 and 885, almost no books were produced in Anglo-Saxon England, and only 3 manuscripts survive from this entire period. Although legal and administrative documents continued to be written, they show clear signs of declining standards in Latin grammar and handwriting. Nowhere is this more apparent than at the Christ Church Scriptorium in Canterbury. By the 870s, its main scribe was elderly, had poor eyesight, and possessed almost no understanding of Latin. His fellow scribes were equally unskilled. As a result, Old English began to replace Latin in many documents, particularly in Canterbury, where wills, land grants, and legal memoranda increasingly appeared in the vernacular. Outside of Canterbury, however, there is evidence that some regions maintained higher literacy standards. In Wessex, a distinct tradition of charter writing persisted into the early 800s and 70s, with documents showing better Latin and a more stable scribal style. This may have been influenced by Frankish connections, as King Ethelwulf employed a Frankish secretary named Felix. Western Mercia may also have preserved better intellectual traditions, as suggested by Alfred's decision to collaborate with Bishop Werfurth of Worcester during his educational reforms. Still, the inability of Canterbury, the most prestigious religious center in England, to produce a competent Latin scribe by the mid-9th century confirms many of Alfred's concerns. Fulco's claim about the end of synods is also supported by the historical record, with the last documented church council in southern Britain taking place in London in November 845. Despite the evident challenges, the Anglo-Saxon Church was not entirely in decline. Throughout the 9th century, religious communities maintained or re-established connections with the wider Christian world and continued to address questions of doctrine and practice. In the 830s, for instance, Bishop Egrid of Lindisfarne wrote to Archbishop Wulfsige of York warning against heretical ideas linked to a so-called Sunday letter, said to have fallen from the sky. These beliefs were being spread by a man named Patrid, who likely obtained the text from an Irish deacon and visionary named Niall. More constructive examples of religious exchange appear in the correspondence of Lupus, abbot of Ferrières. In the early 800s and 50s, Lupus wrote to Archbishop Wigmund and Abbot Eildsige of York to rekindle spiritual ties that had existed since the time of Alcuin. Lupus asked for copies of works by Jerome, Cassiodorus, Quintilian, and Bede, so that a scribe named Lantram, apparently known personally to Eildsige, could copy them in Ferrières. Even in the turbulent 870s, with Viking attacks at their peak, the papacy continued to correspond with the archbishops of both Canterbury and York, a sign of the enduring links between Anglo-Saxon England and the broader Christian world. Letters from the Pope served as reminders to English church leaders about the importance of clerical dress and maintaining church discipline, with a particular emphasis on enforcing proper Christian marriage practices. However, the decline in Latin literacy during this period did not necessarily mean that religious passion or lay devotion had also weakened. While the level of religious construction was lower than in earlier centuries, new churches and religious buildings were still being established or expanded in the middle decades of the 9th century. At Repton in Derbyshire, for instance, major changes were made to the crypt, including the addition of a vaulted stone ceiling supported by 4 columns and new entrances dug into 2 corners. This transformation likely reflected the rising popularity of the local St. Wigstan, a member of the Mertian royal family who was murdered in 849. In Deerhurst, Gloucestershire, the church underwent major rebuilding and was adorned with painted and sculptural decoration. According to accounts from the 11th century, several churches in Northumbria, such as those at Billingham and Norham, were either newly built or extensively remodeled during the tenure of Bishop Ecgfrith, and sculpture from that period has indeed been recovered at both sites. The generosity of lay nobles toward religious causes, especially in Kent, continued to flourish. Their devotion extended beyond sponsoring churches or arranging memorial masses. Documents from this period show them planning for what would happen to their land if they traveled to Rome on pilgrimage, or making arrangements to care for dependents should they retire into religious life. It's difficult to determine if these religious actions were driven by the fear of Viking attacks, but it's worth noting that King Ethelwulf of Wessex sent one of his sons on pilgrimage to Rome in 853, possibly in the hope of gaining divine protection. He himself made the same journey in 855, suggesting a deepening concern with spiritual intervention during these troubled times. Before his journey, Ethelwulf enacted a significant reform that historians refer to as the Second Decimation. He released a tenth of certain lands from royal dues and services, presenting this act as one meant for the benefit of the entire kingdom. In return, churchmen were expected to offer prayers and celebrate masses for the king and his nobles. This initiative, along with the pilgrimage, formed part of a broader religious campaign involving the whole of Wessex. While not directly tied to the Viking threat, it's hard to believe that the looming danger was not a key factor in shaping these choices. Judging the full impact of Viking activity on the English church is difficult. Later, chroniclers often pointed to the Vikings as the main reason behind the decline or collapse of religious institutions. Their tales of heroic resistance or divine punishment aimed at pagan invaders became standard features in medieval storytelling. One such story, told by Roger of Wendover in the 13th century, recounts how the abbess of Coldingham disfigured herself to repel Viking attackers, only for the invaders to burn the monastery and kill its inhabitants, turning them into martyrs. Despite such dramatic narratives, it's often hard to find clear evidence that Viking raids alone caused the destruction of religious houses. Writers like Asser, and even King Alfred himself, recognized that the decline in religious vitality had already begun before the Viking onslaught. By the late 8th century, many monasteries had become little more than valuable landholdings exploited by their owners. Monastic life was changing too, with fewer monks and nuns in residence and more clerics taking their place. These internal developments may better explain the disappearance of certain institutions than any external violence. For example, Mediehamstede, later known as Peterborough, was said to have been destroyed by Vikings in 870, yet records from the time suggest the site had already been taken over by secular landowners and was no longer functioning as a monastery in the traditional sense. Likewise, archaeological evidence shows that the nunnery at Nasing in Essex was abandoned in the 9th century, not because of Viking attacks, but likely due to the loss of royal support after the East Saxon kingdom was absorbed by its neighbors. This is not to say that Viking activity didn't deeply affect religious life. Alfred's own writings spoke of widespread devastation, implying major damage to churches, libraries, and centers of learning. The collapse of Latin writing at Canterbury, for example, occurred just as Viking raids intensified in Kent, and the near-total loss of manuscripts from the mid-9th century strongly suggests looting and destruction. Similarly, the absence of records from religious houses in Northumbria, East Anglia, and the East Midlands points to major disruptions, likely caused by Viking forces. In several areas, bishops vanished from the historical record for decades, leaving behind broken lines of succession. Even in places that were not destroyed, the pressures of defense against the Vikings strained church resources. Charters from the early 10th century describe lands stripped of livestock and crops, and efforts made to restore them. Church leaders, such as the bishops of Worcester and Winchester, had to lease out lands to help pay off raiders. Religious institutions were also drawn into the military burden. As early as 811, a land grant to the Archbishop of Canterbury came with the duty not only to repair fortresses and bridges, but also to destroy Viking fortifications, a rare mention of such tactics in early English records. In the 790s, Mercian rulers had already imposed extra military obligations on churches in response to the growing threat. By the 870s, papal letters hinted at royal encroachments on church lands, perhaps reflecting how rulers like Alfred were diverting ecclesiastical property to support the war effort. Indeed, in some later accounts, Alfred was remembered not as a saintly protector, but as someone who had stripped the church of its wealth. Beyond material loss, the emotional and psychological toll of the Viking attacks cannot be overstated. Alcuin's reaction to the sacking of Lindisfarne captures this perfectly. He described the event as unprecedented and terrifying, a shocking violation that shattered the sense of security. If even a revered center like Lindisfarne could fall, what hope remained for lesser places? Unlike earlier conflicts caused by internal dynastic disputes or neighboring invasions, problems the church had tools to handle. Viking raids seemed unpredictable and savage, immune to traditional solutions. Even if the Vikings weren't more brutal than Christian warriors, their sudden violence and unfamiliar ways made them seem far worse. Monasteries along the coast or on islands were especially vulnerable, and some communities sought refuge inland. The relocation of Abbess Selithryth's community to Canterbury, just a short distance from their original home, is one example. These moves often led to greater reliance on secular protectors and, over time, the erosion of religious independence. Monasteries that shifted location also risked losing control over their landholdings, which sometimes ended up in lay hands. A case in point is the community of St. Cuthbert. In the middle of the 9th century, the monks left Lindisfarne and moved inland, first to Chester-le Street, and eventually to Durham. While later accounts portray them as helpless wanderers driven out by Viking terror, their journey also appears to have served a practical purpose, visiting their estates and reinforcing their claims during a time of immense instability and foreign occupation. Between the years 794 and 835, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records no Viking activity in England. However, this silence likely reflects the intentions of the Chronicle's authors rather than a genuine absence of raids. When Viking activity is mentioned again in the 830s, it is usually in the context of battles involving the West Saxons. Raids are briefly noted, such as the one on Sheppey in 835, but the narrative quickly shifts to military clashes at places like Carhampton in 836 and 843, Hingston Down in 838, and several coastal locations including Southampton, Portland, and Romney Marsh in the early 840s. Whether this indicates a shift in Viking strategy or simply a deliberate effort by the Chronicle's compilers to highlight West Saxon resistance remains uncertain. What is clear is that the Chronicle selectively reports Viking activity during this time. By the 850s, Viking incursions had begun to change in both size and purpose. Raiding fleets that once consisted of around 30 ships were now growing significantly. In 851, a massive Viking force, said to include 350 ships, attacked Canterbury and London. Although that number may seem exaggerated, similar fleet sizes are confirmed by records from the continent, which mention fleets of up to 260 ships in the 860s and 120 ships as early as the 840s. The year 851 also marked the first known instance of Vikings choosing to stay in England over the winter, establishing a base on the Isle of Thanet. This trend of wintering in foreign lands had already begun in Ireland in 840 and in Francia by 843, indicating a broader evolution in Viking tactics. Despite the growing intensity of the raids, the chronicle continues to portray the Anglo-Saxons, especially the West Saxons, as capable of mounting strong defenses. The large Viking force of 851, for example, was met by King Ethelwulf and his son Ethelbald, who are said to have dealt the enemy a devastating defeat. That same year, another of Ethelwulf's sons, Ethelstan, together with the nobleman Aelhir, won a significant victory at Sandwich on the east coast of Kent. Not all battles ended in success. Aelhir was later killed fighting on Thanet in 853. Still, the overall tone of the chronicle suggests that, up until the 860s, the Viking threat was seen as persistent, but not unmanageable. This perception changed dramatically in the winter of 865, with the arrival of what the chronicle calls the Great Heathen Army. Unlike earlier raiders who came seeking treasure, this force appeared determined to conquer and settle. It was not a newly assembled group from Scandinavia, but rather a coalition of seasoned warriors already active across Britain, Ireland, and the Frankish lands. One of its key leaders, Ivar, had previously been involved in campaigns in Ireland, and the army included multiple kings and a host of powerful earls. Though loosely organized, this coalition proved to be highly effective and well coordinated. Their first major action was to make peace with the East Anglians, who supplied them with horses and provisions. Then, in the autumn of 866, the army turned north toward York, exploiting a moment of political instability in Northumbria. The local population had recently overthrown King Osbert and replaced him with Ella, a man whose claim to the throne was questionable. Although later accounts depict them as brothers, their rivalry had left the kingdom deeply divided. The Vikings took advantage of this division, captured York, and killed both kings in battle. By the following year, they had established control over Northumbria. Later accounts suggest they raided as far as the River Tyne and installed a local man, Ecgbert, as a puppet ruler over part of the region. East Anglia was the next target. In the winter of 869, the Viking army crossed Mercia and set up camp at Thetford. King Edmund of East Anglia led resistance against them, but was ultimately defeated and killed. This marked the first clear instance in the chronicle of a Viking force conquering an Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Edmund would later be remembered as a martyr slain by pagans, and his memory was enshrined in coinage and religious devotion. Coins bearing his name appeared by the end of the 9th century, and by the middle of the 10th century, the church at Bedrisesworth, later known as Bury St. Edmunds, claimed to house his relics. Mercia had already faced the Viking threat earlier, when the army spent the winter of 867 in Nottingham. Despite support from the West Saxons, the Mercians failed to expel the invaders and were forced to make peace. Similar settlements were made when the Vikings stayed in London in 871 and in Torksey in 872. These agreements likely placed a heavy financial burden on Mercia, but the greatest crisis came when the Vikings moved to Repton in 873. At Repton, the army seized a site of deep spiritual and royal significance, St. Wystan's Church, which housed the tombs of Mercian kings. This location also had strategic value, offering control over the River Trent and access to key routes such as the Icknield Way. The Vikings fortified the area, digging defensive ditches and using the church as an entrance to their enclosure. Within this compound, they buried their dead, including in the old mortuary chapel just to the west. At the same time, another Viking group, likely linked to the same army, was performing cremation rituals and burial under mounds at Heath Wood, Ingleby, a site clearly visible from Repton. These actions, both religious and military in nature, marked the army's deepening presence in the heart of Anglo-Saxon England. During this period, the Vikings forced King Burgred of Mercia into exile. He made his way to Rome, where he died not long after, and was buried in the Church of Santa Maria, located in the city's English quarter. In Burgred's place, the Vikings installed a new ruler named Ceolwulf. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle dismissively refers to him as a foolish king's thegn, suggesting that his appointment was not taken seriously by some. Yet, despite this portrayal, Ceolwulf's authority was evidently accepted by the people of Mercia at the time. He issued his own official documents without acknowledging Viking control, and was supported by members of the Mercian church and nobility, including 2 senior nobles who had previously served under Burgred. When the Vikings returned to Mercia in 877, they divided the land with Ceolwulf, leaving him in charge of the western portion of the kingdom, often referred to as English Mercia. He held this position until at least 879. Like Mercia, Wessex also faced frequent Viking attacks during the 870s. While the West Saxons did win some battles, it was generally the Viking army that held the upper hand. After taking the throne in 871, King Alfred suffered a defeat at Wilton, and after several more engagements, he was forced to make peace on the condition that the Vikings would leave Wessex. When they returned in 876, Alfred once again had to negotiate, accepting hostages and promises of peace. But the following year, Viking forces managed to occupy much of Wessex, and the West Saxon royal line came dangerously close to being wiped out entirely. In early 878, the Vikings launched a surprise attack and seized Chippenham. They overran West Saxon territory, causing many to flee while others submitted. Alfred managed to escape and went into hiding with a small group of loyal followers. He moved through the wild and marshy regions of the kingdom, avoiding capture. By Easter that year, Alfred had established a defensive base on the island of Athelney in the Somerset levels. From this position, he began launching attacks against the Viking occupiers. Eventually, he was able to gather troops from Somerset, Wiltshire, and part of Mercian authority. In May, his forces met the Viking army in battle at Edington and managed to drive them into retreat. The survivors took refuge in a fortress, which Alfred's army laid siege to. After 2 weeks, the Vikings surrendered. They gave Alfred hostages and swore oaths of loyalty. Their leader, Guthrum, agreed to be baptized as a Christian. 3 weeks later, Guthrum and 30 of his leading warriors were baptized near Athelney. Afterwards, Guthrum's army withdrew from Wessex, traveling through Mercia and eventually settling in East Anglia, where Guthrum took power as king. At some point after this, Alfred and Guthrum formalized an agreement establishing a boundary between their kingdoms, running up the Thames, along the River Lea, and then to the River Ouse and Watling Street. Alfred is often celebrated as the king who saved England from Viking domination. However, this image is somewhat misleading. In Alfred's time, there was no unified kingdom called England. That concept would only come into being under the rule of his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. What Alfred achieved at Edington was the immediate survival of Wessex. He did not defeat all the Viking forces in Britain, only one powerful army. His lasting importance lies less in that victory and more in what he did afterwards to strengthen and reform his kingdom. The year after Edington, a fresh Viking force landed at Fulham. Though they soon moved on to campaign in Francia, they returned to England in 892. Their movements during this time were closely followed in the Chronicle. Over the next 4 years, they were locked in a prolonged struggle with Alfred and his allies. But by the summer of 896, the Viking threat had diminished. The Chronicle even noted that, by the grace of God, the army had not, on the whole, greatly afflicted the English people. This stark contrast between the devastation caused by the Viking army of 865 and the less successful campaigns of the 890s highlights the effectiveness of Alfred's reforms. While the early Mercian kings of the 8th century remain obscure due to a lack of sources, Alfred's reign is exceptionally well documented. More written material survives from his time than from that of any earlier Anglo-Saxon king, and very few of his successors inspired a similar volume of writing. In addition to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, we also have a biography written by the Welsh scholar Asser in the early 890s. Although fewer royal charters survive from Alfred's reign compared to his predecessors, he was the only West Saxon king after Ene to issue a new law code. Even more remarkable are the literary works associated with Alfred's court. A number of Latin texts were translated into Old English, many of them likely sponsored by Alfred himself. It is possible that Alfred personally translated several of these works, including Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, Augustine's Soliloquies, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, and the first 50 Psalms. While it's difficult to prove Alfred's authorship with complete certainty, the similarities in style and ideas across these texts suggest they may have come from a single hand. The shared themes and consistent tone point to a deliberate intellectual project guided by Alfred's vision. Because so much was written during Alfred's lifetime, and so much of it survives, we know more about him than about any other Anglo-Saxon ruler. His own writings offer a rare glimpse into his thoughts and personality. This abundance of material makes Alfred appear unique and exceptional. Not surprisingly, some modern historians have cautioned against accepting this image too readily. Since most of the surviving records come from Alfred's own circle, they may have been intended to promote his greatness and distinguish him from other rulers. Even so, Alfred's achievements stand out. The survival of these texts may partly be due to luck, but not entirely. Alfred, more than any earlier Anglo-Saxon king, made a conscious effort to govern through the use of writing and to shape his image and authority through the production of literature. In this way, he resembled the great rulers of the Carolingian world, such as Charlemagne or Charles the Bald. It is likely that Alfred took inspiration from them in crafting his cultural and political agenda. What makes Alfred's rise even more remarkable is the fact that he was never expected to become king. He was the youngest son of King Ethelwulf, and 3 of his older brothers ruled before him. At least one of those brothers, Ethelred, had sons of his own, though they were too young to rule when he died. In any case, royal succession in Wessex was not always smooth or uncontested. Even though the kingship stayed within the family line of Ecgbert, internal tensions and rival claims were part of the political reality. Despite these challenges, Alfred rose to power and managed to achieve a lasting legacy that would shape the future of England. While King Ethelwulf was away on pilgrimage, his son Ethelbald took advantage of his absence and seized the West Saxon throne in 856. When Ethelwulf returned from the continent, the kingdom was split between them. Ethelbald controlled the western lands, the core of the old West Saxon territory, while Ethelwulf governed the eastern lands, which had been acquired more recently. The exact reasons behind Ethelbald's rebellion remain unclear, but he was backed by powerful figures such as the Bishop of Sherborne and the Ealdorman of Somerset. One possible cause of tension was Ethelwulf's marriage to Judith, daughter of the Frankish ruler Charles the Bald. She was consecrated as queen, a move that elevated her status above that of Ethelbald's mother and went against previous customs. If this union had produced a son, it would have posed a direct threat to Ethelbald's ambitions. After his father's death, Ethelbald himself married Judith, even though such a union was against church law, a sign of the influence and prestige she carried. The internal discord did not end with the deaths of Ethelwulf in 858 and Ethelbald in 860. Even the reigns of Ethelbert and Ethelred were marked by unresolved tensions. Alfred's own will reflects these disputes, offering lengthy explanations and defenses concerning the estates he had inherited or distributed. At one point during his reign, Alfred had to justify his possession of certain lands in a public forum, suggesting that some of his relatives were dissatisfied and influential enough to challenge his authority. After Alfred's death in 899, the issue of succession reignited when his cousin Ethelwold, son of the late King Ethelred, contested the throne. Given his position as the youngest son, Alfred may have originally been intended for a religious life. As a child, he was deeply involved in spiritual practices. He is said to have learned the divine office, frequently visited churches and shrines, prayed extensively, and kept a personal book of psalms and prayers. While this might suggest plans for an ecclesiastical path, it may instead reflect a wider trend influenced by Carolingian ideals. These ideals emphasized that even lay nobles, particularly rulers, bore heavy spiritual responsibilities and should dedicate themselves to prayer and reflection on holy texts. This outlook often clashed with the realities of noble life, especially when it came to violence and sexuality. Like others of his time, Alfred struggled with these tensions. As a young man, he was deeply troubled by what he saw as uncontrollable desires, and according to one account, he prayed for a physical affliction that would help him resist temptation. He was struck by illness, likely a form of hemorrhoids, which he believed came as a divine answer. Although this affliction eventually passed, it was replaced by a more serious condition, possibly Crohn's disease, that stayed with him throughout his life. The image of a physically frail and spiritually anxious Alfred may seem difficult to reconcile with the victorious warrior king who led troops at Edington. This contradiction has led some to question the authenticity of his biography, especially since the original manuscript was destroyed in a fire in 1731, and only early modern copies remain. Some, like Alfred Smith, have even suggested that the biography might be a later monastic fabrication. Despite these doubts, most historians agree that the text dates to Alfred's time and reflects his true personality. For Alfred, inner struggles with temptation and moral failure were just as real and threatening as the Viking invasions. In his own writings, he often refers to lust and desire as forces that disrupt both mental clarity and physical well-being. These concerns were not uncommon for rulers of his age. His piety should be seen not as the invention of later monks, but as a genuine reflection of a man who knew he was destined to rule and who was acutely aware of the spiritual dangers that came with power. There is also strong evidence that Alfred was being groomed for leadership from a young age. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle records that in 853, while still a child, he was sent to Rome by his father, where Pope Leo IV consecrated him as king. Acer, a close associate of Alfred, also mentions this event. Another source, the Liber Vitae of San Salvatore in Brescia, lists Alfred and his brother Ethelred together, suggesting that they both made the journey. A surviving letter from Pope Leo confirms that Alfred received honors in Rome, including the consular belt and garments, a ceremonial recognition similar to those given to Roman consuls. Whether this event was later exaggerated or misunderstood is uncertain. It may have been a symbolic gesture that was later interpreted as an early sign of Alfred's royal destiny. Alternatively, it could have been a deliberate attempt by Ethelwulf to ensure that his sons, especially Alfred and Ethelred, were not left out of future claims to the throne. Regardless of the meaning behind the ceremony, Alfred did eventually become king in 871 and ruled until his natural death in 899. He came to power at a time when the situation looked bleak. Viking armies had already overwhelmed two Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and both Mercia and Wessex were under serious threat. Yet even before his famous military success at Edington in 878, Alfred had already begun to display the qualities of a strong and visionary leader. Around 875, he launched a significant reform of the West Saxon coinage. This new series, known as the cross and lozenge type, restored the coin's weight and silver content and introduced designs inspired by classical Roman patterns. Interestingly, some of these coins were minted in London, as well as in other parts of what could be called Greater Wessex. One coin even carried the title Rex SM, likely meaning King of the Saxons and Mercians. This suggests that after the removal of King Burgred in 873 or 874, Alfred had extended his influence into Mercian territory, including London. However, Alfred was not acting alone in London. His coinage reforms were conducted in cooperation with King Ceolwulf II of Mercia, continuing a tradition of joint monetary efforts between the two kingdoms. Still, Alfred seems to have held the upper hand. On one set of coins, both kings appear under the two emperors design, but while Ceolwulf is simply labeled King, Alfred is described as King of the Angles, or perhaps even King of the English. Alfred's control over Mercia became more pronounced after Ceolwulf's rule came to an end in the late 800s and 70s. He was succeeded by a man named Ethelred, whose background is unknown. By the early 880s, Ethelred had recognized Alfred's authority and governed what remained of Mercia as an ealdorman rather than as a king. Their alliance was strengthened when Ethelred married Alfred's daughter, Ethelfled. The partnership appears to have been close and effective. In 886, Alfred entrusted Ethelred with control over London, collaborating with him to rebuild parts of the old Roman city and establish new settlements. Similar arrangements were likely made in other Mercian cities, such as Gloucester and Worcester. From the mid-800s onward, Alfred began to use the title King of the Anglo-Saxons, signaling his leadership over both Wessex and Mercia. There is also evidence that he and his court were starting to explore broader ideas of collective identity. The chronicle reports that in 886, all the English people not under Danish control submitted to Alfred, an early step toward the vision of a unified England. Alfred's treaty with Guthrum referred to the approval of the councillors of all the English race, suggesting a growing idea of unity among the Anglo-Saxon people. However, this sense of a single English identity appears only briefly and sporadically in the texts associated with Alfred. Occasionally, broader royal titles were used, such as when Asser called Alfred ruler of all the Christians on the island of Britain. This may have reflected the submission of several Welsh rulers, as Asser mentions kings from Dyfed, Glywysing, Gwent, and Brycheiniog. Yet these grand titles were not adopted as a consistent part of Alfred's official style. Until his death, Alfred referred to himself simply as King of the Anglo-Saxons. Despite the progress made during the 800s and 800s, the reappearance of a large Viking army in 892 revealed just how fragile Alfred's kingdom still was. The triumph at Edington in 878 had only bought time, allowing Alfred to prepare for future threats. In the introduction to his translation of Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care, likely written in the early 890s, Alfred reflected on the past as a golden age when kings were godly, maintained peace and order, expanded their realms, and were wise and successful in war. This vision mirrored Alfred's own aspirations for his reign, linking military strength with intellectual and moral leadership. For Alfred, wisdom and warfare were interconnected. One was empty without the other. He thus sought to strengthen his realm through reforms in both the military and educational spheres. Alfred recognized that Viking success wasn't due to superior strength, but to more effective tactics. Viking armies were swift and mobile, avoiding direct battle and instead relying on raids, retreating before they could be confronted. In contrast, Anglo-Saxon forces were designed for large-scale battles, often reacting too slowly. Alfred's solution was to divide his military forces, ensuring that while one part was on active duty, the other remained at home. This created a rotating standing army capable of quicker responses, although the system was not perfect. On at least one occasion, soldiers abandoned a siege before being relieved. Still, this new structure made his forces more agile. More significant were Alfred's efforts to create a network of fortified towns, known as burhs, across his kingdom. Fortified centers had existed before, but Alfred's innovation was to organize them as a coordinated system, each within a day's journey of the next. Many were located near rivers or major roads, disrupting Viking movements and improving communication and defense. However, building and maintaining these defenses was costly and labor-intensive. According to one record, over 27,000 men were needed to garrison the burhs. The construction and upkeep placed heavy demands on Alfred's subjects, already exhausted by decades of warfare. Even Asser noted how Alfred had to push his people hard, sometimes scolding them for their delays or lack of commitment. But Alfred knew military measures alone were insufficient. Echoing earlier thinkers like Alcuin, he believed the Vikings were a punishment from God, whose protection had been withdrawn due to the people's failings. Alfred viewed the decline of learning and wisdom among the Anglo-Saxons as a major cause of their vulnerability. To revive education, he invited scholars from around Britain and the continent to his court. Figures such as Asser from Wales, Bishop Werfurth from Worcester, John from Saxony, and Grimbald from Saint Omer were all part of this intellectual revival. While Latin remained the core language of Christian learning in Western Europe, the level of literacy in England had fallen so far that Alfred focused on translating important texts into Old English. Some translations were done by others, like Verfurth's version of Gregory's dialogues, but several were attributed directly to Alfred himself, assisted by his court scholars. Alfred believed that education was essential not only for the clergy, but also for secular leaders. He emphasized that all officials needed wisdom to govern justly and effectively. His translations focused on texts that provided both practical guidance and spiritual inspiration. He even threatened to remove nobles who failed to learn, and Asser records how many high-ranking men, despite being illiterate from youth, made great efforts to study rather than lose their positions. Alfred's understanding of kingship was further reflected in his legal work. His law code, far from inventing new laws, compiled and adapted earlier Anglo-Saxon codes from kings like Ethelbert of Kent, Ino of Wessex, and Offa of Mercia. Notably, Alfred included the entire code of King Ine. The originality of Alfred's approach lay not in the laws themselves, but in how he framed them. He began with a preface that traced the development of divine law, from the 10 Commandments through the Apostles and Church Councils, culminating in his own efforts. This created a direct link between his laws and sacred tradition. Even the total number of chapters in the Law Code, 120, was symbolic, referencing the age of Moses at death and the number of people present at Pentecost. While earlier Anglo-Saxon rulers had been Christian, Alfred was the first to develop a vision of kingship rooted completely in Christian moral and legal ideals. His rule marked the beginning of a new era in which royal authority was closely tied to religious duty, education, and divine justice. Through military innovation, educational reform, and legal consolidation, Alfred shaped the foundations of a Christian monarchy in England that would influence future generations. In the harsh winter of 878, as Alfred sought refuge in the marshlands of Athelney, it seemed as though Anglo-Saxon kingship was on the brink of collapse. Yet, in less than 2 generations, his grandson Aethelstan would come to rule a realm that bore a striking resemblance to modern England. Alongside this remarkable territorial expansion, Aethelstan and those who followed him would introduce new ways of governing and new strategies for managing the lands now under their control. Much of what we know about this era is shaped by later sources and modern interpretations, which often focus heavily on the achievements of West Saxon expansion. But looking back through the lens of history can be misleading. The fact that England became unified in the 10th century does not mean that such an outcome was predetermined, or that there was always a clear desire or vision for unity. It's a mistake to assume that each king pursued this end deliberately, or to measure their success against a goal that may never have been on their minds. In reality, the path to unity was anything but straight. Territories changed hands repeatedly, and political fragmentation was just as common as consolidation. Deep-rooted local loyalties and older identities continued to influence events and could resurface as conditions shifted. West Saxon expansion often came at the expense of emerging political communities in the north and east, regions reshaped by Viking conquest during the 9th century. Unfortunately, our understanding of these new power structures is limited, as the surviving sources generally reflect a West Saxon point of view. The northern regions, in particular, are seen through southern eyes, and the details of Scandinavian settlement in areas known as the Danelaw remain elusive. Archaeology, place names, and even genetic studies give us glimpses into these settlements. Although scholars have often tried to determine the number of settlers or how densely they lived, These sources may be more useful for understanding how new identities formed and how people adapted to the realities of the 10th century. During this time, England also experienced sweeping changes in religious life. Much of the written material from the period highlights what came to be known as the Benedictine reforms. Influenced both by European models and their own readings of early Christian texts, English church leaders aimed to renew and reshape religious communities, particularly through monastic practices rooted in the rule of Saint Benedict. These efforts, especially under King Edgar, enjoyed significant royal support, and monasteries benefited from generous patronage. These institutions played a key role in standardizing the Old English language and promoting specific styles of art and manuscript design. Still, while the Benedictine reforms dominate the historical record, their influence was not uniform. In many parts of England, they had little or no lasting effect. It was, instead, the quieter rise of local churches and new systems of pastoral care, often undocumented, that would bring deeper, long-term changes to religious practice. The question of how the Scandinavian settlement influenced this landscape remains one of the most challenging and hotly debated issues in early medieval history. As with earlier periods of migration, historians have traditionally debated how many Scandinavians came to England and what sort of people they were, whether they were a small group of elites or large numbers of ordinary farmers. Researchers have turned to a range of evidence, including place names, burial customs, settlement remains, material culture, and increasingly, scientific tools like archaeogenetics. Today, few believe that this evidence can provide a straightforward count of how many settlers arrived. Instead, there is growing awareness that ethnic identity in the early Middle Ages was complex. Material goods and language don't simply reflect ancestry. Rather, identities were shaped through lived experiences, social networks, political ties, and community interactions. The identities that emerged in the Danelaw weren't simple reflections of Danish or Norwegian heritage. Instead, they were something new, distinctly Anglo-Scandinavian, forged in response to the unique conditions of life in 10th century England. Just as Anglo-Saxon identity had developed gradually in Britain, rather than being imported wholesale from the continent, so too did these hybrid identities evolve to suit local needs and realities. In many cases, those adopting an Anglo-Scandinavian identity may not have had Scandinavian roots at all. These layered identities also reflect the diverse makeup of the Viking armies that settled in England. Far from being monolithic, these forces were composed of many different groups. Bands of warriors who had spent seasons campaigning in Britain, Ireland, and across the continent, often with little contact with their Scandinavian homelands. The label Danish, frequently used in Anglo-Saxon writings, oversimplifies a much more complex web of ethnic backgrounds and shifting loyalties. Moreover, these Viking armies were not the only ones to settle in England. While scholars still debate whether additional waves came directly from Scandinavia after the initial conquests, there is strong evidence of further migration into northwestern England. Irish and Welsh sources describe Vikings being driven out of Dublin in the early 10th century, with some settling in regions like the Wirral, Cumbria, and Lancashire. These newcomers are often referred to as Hiberno-Norse, a term that reflects their time in Ireland and distinguishes them from the Danes who settled elsewhere. However, the urge to draw hard lines between these groups can be misleading. Ethnic boundaries were fluid, and political alliances were often formed out of convenience rather than shared heritage. The historical record provides little detail about how the settlement process unfolded or how power was organized in these areas. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, for example, mentions that in 876, the Viking leader Helfdene divided Northumbrian lands among his men, who then began farming. Yet it offers no further insight. Elsewhere, the chronicle names various Scandinavian kings, earls, and nobles, often using the title hold, but without enough information to reconstruct their political relationships. Outside Northumbria, the chronicle portrays settlement as focused on fortified urban centers such as Northampton and Leicester, each apparently with its own military force. However, details are scarce. Some passages refer to a collective known as the Five Boroughs: Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, Stamford, and Derby. But what this meant in practice is unclear. It's likely that even those compiling the chronicle lacked a full understanding of the complex and shifting political order of the Danelaw. Alliances were temporary, power structures fragile, and local authority often short-lived. Coinage from the period reinforces this sense of fragmentation. A wide array of rulers minted coins, many of whom are unknown beyond these artifacts, and several small, short-lived mints emerged during this time. There is also little written evidence about how Scandinavians and Anglo-Saxons interacted, or how existing institutions may have survived under new leadership. One 10th century narrative tells how a Viking leader named Guthred was chosen to rule after a vision from Saint Cuthbert. In gratitude, Guthred granted land to Cuthbert's followers in the north. Stripped of its miraculous framing, this story likely reflects a real political compromise. Viking rulers recognizing the power of local religious communities in exchange for support and legitimacy. Similar arrangements probably occurred elsewhere. Coinage suggests that York's archbishops collaborated with Viking rulers, and one of them, Guthfrith, was even buried in York Minster. Beyond these written accounts, place names offer one of the richest sources for studying Scandinavian influence. Northern and Eastern England are filled with names rooted in Norse language, such as those ending in -by, -thorpe, or those known as Grimston hybrids, which combine elements from both Old English and Norse. However, interpreting these names is far from straightforward. A place with a Norse-sounding name may not have been founded by Scandinavians. The Norse language had already influenced English, and some names simply reflect that linguistic blending. Additionally, many Norse place names appear in the records for the first time in the Domesday Book of 1086. These names could have originated at any time between the late 9th and late 11th centuries, and may not reflect the earliest phase of settlement. Others may have vanished without leaving a trace in written documents. Thus, place name maps mostly show which names were still in use by the late 11th century. The changing landscape also complicates matters. Over time, large estates broke apart into smaller holdings, especially in the later Anglo-Saxon period. In areas that fell early to West Saxon control, new estates may have been named in Old English, not Norse, simply because the land was held by Anglo-Saxon lords when the divisions occurred. One theory links the types of place names to the geography of the land. Grimston names often appear in fertile regions, while names ending in -by or -thorpe are more common in less productive areas. This suggests the former may represent early settlement in prime locations, while the latter may indicate later expansion into more marginal zones. But even this model doesn't fully explain the patterns. Seemingly poor regions, like the wetlands of Amounderness, were in fact quite valuable and well managed. Moreover, many names ending in -by retain Norse grammar, suggesting they may date from an early stage of settlement. This contradicts the idea that such names were created only during later estate fragmentation. Ultimately, no single model can account for the full picture. Place names are shaped by a wide range of factors: social, political, linguistic, and geographic. They reflect interactions between newcomers and locals, as well as the shifting patterns of power, culture, and identity over time. While they may not offer a clear count of settlers, they remain crucial clues in understanding the complex world of early medieval England. In the regions of northern and eastern England, the influence of Scandinavian settlement extended beyond place names and reached into material culture, especially in the realm of stone sculpture. During the 10th century, there was a noticeable rise in the production of stone monuments, and new styles and motifs began to appear. Some of these were applied to traditional forms, such as freestanding crosses, while entirely new forms also emerged. Most notably the hogback, a distinctive house-shaped grave cover often featuring animal carvings at both ends. These monuments are found widely in the north and into southern Scotland, with notable concentrations at places like Brompton and Sockburn. While hogbacks represented a new type of monument, their creators likely drew inspiration from earlier insular art, such as house-shaped reliquaries and decorated grave covers from earlier Anglo-Saxon contexts. Some of the carvings incorporate imagery rooted in Norse mythology, like the figure believed to be the god Vithar confronting the monstrous wolf Fenrir on the Gosforth cross. However, much of this sculpture also depicts secular themes, including armed warriors or aristocratic pastimes like hunting. These sculptures were often created within Christian contexts, and some, such as the Gosforth cross, also feature scenes from the life of Christ. Certain regional clusters even show connections to the church leadership at York. Despite the presence of Norse motifs, the use of Anglo-Saxon styles and religious themes points to a blending of cultures rather than a pure declaration of Scandinavian identity. These works are best seen as expressions of a new Anglo-Scandinavian elite who embraced a fusion of traditions and sought to assert their status within both Christian and native frameworks. The use of pagan imagery may have served as a visual bridge for newly converted Scandinavians, helping them connect familiar stories with Christian teachings, or simply reflected a relaxed attitude toward cultural motifs in a society confident in its Christian identity. Unlike the transformation brought about by the earlier Anglo-Saxon settlement of lowland Britain, archaeological evidence for Scandinavian settlement is relatively sparse. Urban centers, particularly York, show clear signs of bustling trade, industrial activity, and expanded settlement areas. These cities seem to have developed international trade connections, such as with Dublin, earlier than their southern counterparts, which at first had more regional economic ties. Still, the overall urban growth pattern in England throughout the 10th century was consistent, regardless of whether a town was under Anglo-Saxon or Scandinavian control. In the countryside, the effects of Scandinavian colonization are even harder to trace. Many changes in rural settlement patterns, such as the development of villages and the division of large estates into smaller manorial holdings, were occurring across the country regardless of Viking activity. A few rural sites have been tentatively linked to Scandinavian settlers, like the farmsteads at Symie Folds in County Durham, where the buildings show similarities with Scandinavian dwellings found in the North Atlantic. Although carbon dating places these structures within a broad time range that includes the period of Norse settlement, the architectural layout also reflects local traditions, complicating efforts to make definitive cultural attributions. Similarly, settlements that continued across the Middle to later Saxon periods rarely display a clear Scandinavian phase. Some artifacts with Norse-style decoration, like those found at Warham Percy, hint at cultural interaction, but other major sites such as Flicksborough or Sedgeford show little to no evidence of Scandinavian influence or disruption during this period. The archaeological record thus offers only limited confirmation of widespread or distinctive Scandinavian rural colonization. When it comes to burial practices, the picture is just as complex. Only around 40 sites have been identified as potentially Scandinavian in character, a small number compared to early Anglo-Saxon burial grounds. The criteria for identifying Scandinavian burials are also contested. While cremation is often viewed as a clear marker of Norse custom, the only well-documented example from this period is the cemetery at Heath Wood in Derbyshire. Furnished inhumation, burials accompanied by grave goods, has also been considered a potential indicator of Scandinavian presence, but this too is problematic. Such practices, while less common after the 8th century, continued sporadically across Anglo-Saxon England and involved a wide range of items from jewelry to animal remains. Moreover, burial customs in Scandinavia during the Viking Age were themselves highly diverse, with no single Scandinavian rite in use. Viking settlers arriving in England brought with them a variety of burial traditions, and they entered a land where native mortuary practices were already varied and complex. As a result, their funerary customs often blended with local traditions, making it extremely difficult to draw a clear line between native and newcomer in the archaeological record. Overall, the cultural impact of the Scandinavian settlement in England was real but complex. It left visible marks in some areas of artistic production and urban trade networks, while its influence on rural life and burial practices is much harder to isolate. Rather than radically transforming England, the Viking presence often merged with existing structures and traditions, giving rise to hybrid identities and blended cultural expressions. At certain burial sites where it seems reasonable to associate the graves with Scandinavian settlers or their descendants, the rites and grave goods involved may reflect more than just ethnic background. For instance, at Cumwhitton in Cumbria, 6 well-furnished graves dating from the early 10th century were uncovered, 4 belonging to men and 2 to women. Among them, one woman was buried with a pair of domed oval brooches that are typically found in areas influenced by Scandinavian settlement. 3 of the male burials included swords, and one grave also contained horse-riding equipment such as a bridle and spurs, with a surrounding curved ditch that may have once enclosed the grave entirely. These kinds of burials, with military items and carefully planned grave layouts, are common among those attributed to Viking Age communities and are often seen as indicators of high status or warrior identity. However, these richly equipped graves may not always be straightforward reflections of cultural identity. Instead, they could be statements of social rank or power. Much like the grand burials of early Anglo-Saxon leaders, these graves may have served to showcase a family's elite or military position during a period of intense political rivalry. The disappearance of these kinds of burials by the mid-10th century might not suggest a decline in warrior culture, but rather a shift in how status was displayed, through investments in church foundations or the commissioning of sculpture instead of lavish funerals. So far, discussions around Scandinavian influence have largely focused on elite identity, but archaeological discoveries are increasingly showing that this cultural blending extended into wider society. Finds by metal detectorists have revealed a growing number of dress accessories, jewelry, and personal items that blend Anglo-Saxon craftsmanship with Norse stylistic elements. In East Anglia, for example, Numerous brooches decorated in Norse-inspired designs have been found. Yet, while the patterns resemble those from Scandinavian art, their flat shapes are more in line with Anglo-Saxon styles, suggesting they were locally made. Many of these items were produced in base metals, which implies that this mixing of artistic traditions was not limited to the upper classes, but was part of everyday life across the Danelaw. Alongside archaeological and artistic evidence, genetic studies have begun to play a role in understanding the impact of Scandinavian migration. Earlier efforts in this field, based on blood group distributions, yielded unclear results. However, more recent studies that examine a wider range of genetic markers have produced more insightful conclusions. One study from 1998 analyzed multiple genetic systems in people from the East Midlands and identified 5 distinct subgroups. The population in northeast Derbyshire, for instance, appeared genetically different from neighboring areas but closely linked to populations in Denmark. These genetic patterns aligned with the known distribution of Norse place names in the region, supporting the idea of localized Viking influence. Another major genetic project, conducted in 2003, focused on Y chromosomes from men in 25 towns across Britain and Ireland. These samples were compared with populations from Scandinavia and the continent to estimate historical migration patterns. Results showed that areas within the former Danelaw carried a notable amount of Scandinavian genetic material, whereas southern England appeared to have retained a more native genetic profile. This suggested that the Viking settlements of the 9th and 10th centuries may have had a deeper demographic impact than earlier Anglo-Saxon migrations. Between 2002 and 2007, a focused study in the Wirral and West Lancashire looked at the DNA of men with local surnames rooted in medieval records. This group was compared to residents with less historically established names. The analysis revealed a closer genetic connection between these two local groups than with populations in neighboring regions like North Wales, but also showed a clear genetic affinity between the medieval population and Norwegians. These findings pointed to significant Viking migration into that area prior to modern times. Although genetic research offers valuable insights into historical migrations, it also has its limitations. It can be difficult to separate the genetic legacy of ancient movements from that of more recent ones. Moreover, such studies may reveal more about the long-term success and integration of migrant communities than about their original numbers or intentions. Questions also remain about the most effective methods to use and the types of conclusions that genetic data can reliably support. The interpretation of DNA evidence continues to be a topic of debate among scholars studying early medieval migration and identity. One-way scholars have attempted to better understand the origins and movements of people in 9th and 10th century England is by analyzing their skeletal remains. While extracting ancient DNA from bones is possible, the process remains extremely difficult and carries a high risk of contamination. A more reliable method is stable isotope analysis. Elements like oxygen, lead, and strontium found in tooth enamel, absorbed through drinking water in childhood, can offer clues about where a person grew up. Although only a few studies have been conducted so far, the findings are promising. At Repton in Derbyshire, for instance, isotopic analysis of 3 Viking burials from the 870s suggested 2 individuals may have come from Denmark's western coast, while another likely originated from southeastern Sweden. These results highlight the diverse and international character of the Viking forces in England. Although the exact number of Scandinavian settlers has long been a major focus of debate, existing evidence only allows for limited conclusions. Yet this focus on numbers might be less important than previously assumed. The emergence of the distinctive cultural landscape in the Danelaw was shaped by a variety of broader trends and developments. Migration, while significant, was just one part of a much larger picture. Following the death of King Alfred on October 26, 899, his son Edward, later known as Edward the Elder, came to the throne. Given Alfred's military success and reforms, it might seem that his son's succession and the continued dominance of his descendants was inevitable. However, the reality appears more complicated. It's unclear how much of his father's authority Edward truly inherited, especially when it came to control over English Mercia. Furthermore, Edward faced a serious rival in his cousin Ethelwold, son of Alfred's elder brother, Ethelred. Ethelwold had a legitimate claim to the throne and seems to have enjoyed significant support, raising questions about whether Alfred truly intended Edward to succeed him. Some indications suggest Alfred may have favored Edward's son, Ethelstan, as his successor. The early days of Edward's rule were marked by unrest. Soon after Alfred's death, Ethelwold took control of 2 royal estates in Dorset. Edward quickly responded by marching an army to a nearby camp, prompting Ethelwold to flee. Although the Anglo-Saxon chronicle portrays this as a rebellion, it may have been an attempt by Ethelwold to stake his claim to the throne before Edward had been crowned. This interpretation suggests that the royal succession was far from settled at the time. The threat posed by Ethelwold became even more serious when he traveled north and secured the support of the Danish army in Northumbria, who accepted him as their king. It's possible that the Danes saw him as a potential ally or puppet king in Wessex, or perhaps Ethelwold's network of support was stronger than the traditional narratives suggest. Either way, there was a clear alignment of interests between Ethelwold and the Danes. In 901, Ethelwold returned to England with a fleet, landing in Essex. Over the next 2 years, he convinced the Danes in East Anglia to break their peace with Edward. Together, they launched raids into Mercia and Wessex. Edward responded by leading his own forces into East Anglia, where he ravaged parts of the region, though he avoided direct confrontation with Ethelwold. Eventually, after Edward's withdrawal, a segment of his army remained behind and was ambushed. A bloody battle followed, resulting in heavy losses on both sides. Ethelwold, the East Anglian ruler Eoric, and a prominent Mercian noble named Breitseig were all killed. What stands out about Ethelwold's campaign is the wide-ranging support he was able to command. His alliances stretched across Wessex, Northumbria, East Anglia, and likely Mercia and Essex. For a time, he may have held more actual power than Edward himself. Edward's hesitation to face him in open battle may have been a calculated move rather than a sign of weakness. In truth, the reach of Edward's authority during these early years is difficult to determine. His official title, King of the Anglo-Saxons, suggests control over a unified Wessex and Mercia. However, the extent of his practical influence remains uncertain, especially in relation to Ethelred and Ethelfled, the rulers of Mercia and Edward's in-laws. Ethelred had submitted to Alfred's overlordship during the 880s, a relationship acknowledged in royal documents from that period. But after Alfred's death, such references disappear. Documents issued by Ethelred and his wife Ethelfled present them as independent rulers. Some even describe them as holding sole authority over the Mercians, using terms that closely resemble titles like king and queen. These records indicate a more complex and perhaps cooperative political arrangement between Wessex and Mercia than later histories suggest. In several 10th century accounts, Ethelred is referred to as King of Mercia, and Ethelfled is similarly called Queen by various Welsh and Irish sources from the same era. One particularly valuable source is a group of entries preserved in some versions of the Anglo-Saxon chronicle, known as the Mercian Register or the Annals of Ethelfled. These entries offer a distinctly Mercian viewpoint on events of the early 10th century and shed light on Ethelfled's leadership, particularly her military actions against Viking and Welsh forces following her husband's death in 911. Ethelfled emerges in these records as an authoritative and independent ruler, devising her own strategies and engaging in military campaigns. This portrayal places her in the tradition of influential Mercian women, and it may reflect the political culture of Mercia, which arguably allowed women more room to exercise power than the more conservative courtly environment of Wessex. Despite this, the coinage minted in Mercia during this period bore only Edward's name, and both Ethelred and Ethelfled appear in several of Edward's charters as acknowledging his authority over Mercia. By around 909, Edward could command the combined forces of Wessex and Mercia, as evidenced by a campaign into Northumbria. Although Edward's rule over the broader Anglo-Saxon realm may have been formally recognized by the Mercian rulers, they continued to operate with significant autonomy, and later observers clearly saw something royal in their position. Their other initiatives reinforce this impression. Ethelred and Ethelfled founded a new church in Gloucester, now partly visible in its ruins and through archaeological research. In 909, they relocated the remains of St. Oswald from Bardney in Lincolnshire to this church, a symbolic act since Bardney had once been the site of Oswald's shrine under the care of Osthryth, another prominent Mercian queen. Both Ethelred and Ethelfled were eventually buried at Gloucester, suggesting they envisioned the site as a new royal burial ground, perhaps replacing the former mausoleum at Repton, which had been destroyed during the Viking invasions. Government in early 10th century England might best be understood as a shared family enterprise. Edward's brother-in-law and, increasingly, his sister wielded real power in their region of the kingdom, but always within the overarching supremacy of Edward. When Ethelred died in 911, Edward took direct control of London, Oxford, and nearby areas, while Ethelfled assumed full authority over the rest of English Mercia. Over the following years, until their respective deaths in 918 and 924, both Edward and Ethelfled concentrated on military campaigns aimed at regaining territory from the Vikings. Much of what we know about these efforts comes from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which often focuses on the construction of fortified towns, or burhs, followed by the surrender of local Viking forces and communities. Even before these fortifications were built, Edward had pursued different approaches. His legal codes mention peace treaties with Viking groups, and one version of the chronicle states that he made peace with the armies of East Anglia and Northumbria out of necessity. Additionally, charters from the reign of his son, Aethelstan, suggest that Edward and Ethelred had encouraged their nobles to purchase land in Viking-held areas, as seen in places like Bedfordshire and Derbyshire, likely a strategic move to extend influence into these territories. By 909, Edward shifted to more aggressive tactics, leading joint campaigns with the Mercian and West Saxon armies into Northumbria. The following year, the Northumbrian forces retaliated with a raid into Mercia, but were defeated at Tettenhall. This battle resulted in heavy losses for the Vikings, including the deaths of several kings and nobles. From 911 onward, Edward adopted a more defensive posture by building burhs at key points such as Hertford and Witham to block Viking advances from East Anglia and the East Midlands. Over time, this strategy turned into an offensive one, with Edward pushing deeper into Danish-controlled territory. Meanwhile, Ethelfled strengthened Mercia's northern and western defenses, protecting against threats from the Vikings in the East Midlands, as well as from the Irish Sea and Wales. By the time of her death in 918, nearly all Viking forces south of the Humber, apart from those in Nottingham and perhaps Lincoln, had submitted to either her or Edward. Edward secured the allegiance of regions such as Essex, East Anglia, and Cambridge, while Ethelfled accepted the submission of Derby and Leicester. The people of York also offered allegiance to Ethelfled, though she died before anything formal could be established. The meaning of such submissions is difficult to determine. Between 910 and his death in 924, Edward issued no known charters, or at least none have survived in authentic form. If land was redistributed to Edward's followers following his victories, there's little written evidence of it. In fact, some Viking landowners seem to have retained their estates, or regained them through Edward's administration. Figures like Earl Thurforth of Northampton remained influential, and moneyers who had operated under Viking rule continued minting coins under Edward's name. This suggests Edward may have chosen to maintain existing administrative systems rather than dismantle them entirely. The efforts of Edward and Ethelfled were clearly coordinated. They created a chain of fortified sites stretching from the southeast to the northwest, forming a strong defensive line. However, signs of rivalry remain. The Mercian Register presents Ethelflaed as receiving Viking submissions independently without referring to Edward's authority. In contrast, the Winchester-based version of the Chronicle hardly mentions her at all until her death, focusing entirely on Edward's actions. When Ethelflaed died in 918, Edward acted quickly by taking control of Tamworth, where she had passed away. According to the Chronicle, all those who had previously acknowledged Ethelfled's leadership now submitted to Edward. On the same occasion, several Welsh rulers also pledged their allegiance to him. The Mercian Register adds that Elfwin, daughter of Ethelred and Ethelfled, was removed from power and taken into Wessex. Whether this was to suppress a potential rival or simply to prevent any resistance is uncertain. Had Elfwin been a son rather than a daughter, Edward might have faced a much greater challenge in asserting his authority over Mercia. That same year, Edward received the surrender of Stamford and captured Nottingham, stationing both English and Danish forces there. In 919, he expanded his influence further by building a burh at Thelwall near the Mersey and restoring Manchester, likely reviving its old Roman fort. In 920, he traveled to Bakewell and ordered the construction of yet another burh. According to the Chronicle, this moment marked the high point of his reign, as the kings of Scotland, Strathclyde, and leaders across Northumbria, English, Danes, and Norse alike, acknowledged him as their overlord. This event may not have been a simple act of submission, as described by the Chronicle. It might have been a diplomatic agreement recognizing recent shifts in territorial control. Ragnald, who had taken York the year before, likely saw this as a political arrangement rather than fealty. Still, whatever the interpretation, Edward's accomplishments during his two-decade reign remain significant. Edward passed away in June 924, and his succession took an unusual turn. In Wessex, his second son, Elfweard, was recognized as king, while in Mercia, his eldest son, Ethelstan, took power. It remains uncertain whether Edward had intended for his kingdom to be divided in this way. Given the vast gains made during his reign, He may not have been committed to maintaining a single unified realm. Alternatively, this split could reflect the persistence of regional loyalties. Aethelstan, having campaigned in Mercia alongside his aunt and uncle, Ethelfled and Ethelred, may have been more appealing to the Mercians than his younger half-brother. Elfwerd died shortly after his accession, which allowed Aethelstan to reunite the kingdom under his rule. Even so, Aethelstan faced resistance, particularly in Wessex's stronghold of Winchester, and his coronation did not take place until September 925 at Kingston upon Thames, a symbolic location near the border of Wessex and Mercia. Aethelstan's control over Northumbria came quickly and decisively. In 926, he arranged a marriage between his sister and Sitric, the Norse ruler of York and successor to Ragnald. The fact that this alliance was finalized at Tamworth, a central location within Aethelstan's domain, hints at his superior position in the agreement. After Sitric's death the following year, Aethelstan took control of Northumbria, although it appears he may have had to contend with rivals such as Guthfrith, a Scandinavian leader with previous activity in both Britain and Ireland. One version of the chronicle records that Aethelstan expelled Guthfrith from the kingdom during this period. Following his consolidation of the north, Aethelstan is said to have received the submission of all the other kings of Britain at Aemont, where they swore oaths and pledged peace. Later accounts suggest that Aethelstan rewarded his followers with lavish gifts and destroyed the Norse fortifications at York, further cementing his authority. A poem written by a cleric named Peter, likely based at the New Minster in Winchester, celebrated these achievements. It portrays Aethelstan as the ruler of a newly unified England and praises him as a glorious and valiant king. However, the peace established at Aemont was short-lived. In 934, Aethelstan launched a massive campaign into Scotland, deploying both land and naval forces that reached as far north as Caithness. The reasons for this attack remain unclear, but it may have been a response to emerging threats from multiple fronts. In 937, a powerful coalition of enemies confronted Aethelstan at the Battle of Brunanburh. This alliance included Norse forces from Dublin led by Olaf Guthfrithson, Scottish troops under King Constantine Thurx, and warriors from Strathclyde under Owain. Despite facing a formidable army, Aethelstan achieved a resounding victory. The battle was later commemorated in an epic poem included in the chronicle, emphasizing the slaughter of enemy forces and the retreat of the survivors across the sea. Although Brunanburh appeared to secure Aethelstan's dominance, Northumbria remained a contested and fragile region. The area was influenced by various competing powers. Apart from the Scandinavians based in Ireland and Britain, Aethelstan had to manage the ambitions of the Scottish kingdom and balance relations with the Archbishop of York, the religious community of St. Cuthbert, and the semi-independent rulers of Bamburgh in northern Northumbria. These groups, though technically within the Anglo-Saxon sphere, did not necessarily align with West Saxon authority. For example, when Ealdred of Bamburgh lost his lands to Ragnald around 918, he turned to the Scottish king for help. The Archbishop of York also maintained close ties with Norse rulers, a pattern that continued through the mid-10th century. To secure his position, Aethelstan worked to gain the loyalty of these local powers. In 934, he likely visited the shrine of St. Cuthbert, where he offered rich gifts, including illuminated manuscripts, to demonstrate his respect and seek the community's support. Upon Aethelstan's death in 939, his brother Edmund took the throne. But within a year, Olaf Guthfrithson returned from Ireland, took control of Northumbria, and invaded Mercia. He was aided by Archbishop Wulfstan of York and seized the Five Boroughs region. Although Edmund besieged them at Leicester, he was ultimately forced to recognize Olaf's authority there. After Olaf's death in 942, Edmund reconquered the Five Boroughs. This victory was celebrated in another chronicle poem, portraying Edmund as liberating the local Danes from Norse domination. In 944, he went further, retaking Northumbria and expelling both Olaf Sitriksson and Ragnald Guthfrithsson, brothers and former kings of the region. Still, the struggle for the north persisted. When Edred succeeded Edmund in 946, he too faced difficulties. Olaf Sitriksson returned to claim Northumbria, followed by the rise of a new challenger named Eric, likely the infamous Eric Bloodaxe, whose deeds were later glorified in saga literature. Edred's control over Northumbria was finally established when Eric was expelled, probably around 954. Later traditions claim that Eric was killed at Stainmore in Cumbria by an earl named Maccus. This brought an end to the prolonged conflict and marked the firm integration of Northumbria into the English kingdom. Edred's reign might appear to mark the final step in the formation of a united English kingdom under West Saxon leadership. However, political unity proved fragile. In the late 950s, the kingdom was once again divided when Edmund's son, Edwig, ruled the southern regions, while his younger brother Edgar took control of Mercia and the north. After Edwig's death in 959, Edgar brought the kingdom back together, but similar divisions would occur again in later years, such as during the crises of 1016 and the 1030s. Regional identities also endured. When Edric was named Ealdorman in 1007, the chronicle described his jurisdiction as the Kingdom of the Mercians, indicating how deeply rooted local allegiances remained. Furthermore, sources written after the Norman conquest report that in the 970s, Edgar formally granted Lothian to the Scottish king, Kenneth II. While the actual influence of Anglo-Saxon authority over Lothian is hard to determine, Edgar may have simply been acknowledging a reality that the region had already fallen under Scottish control. Still, Lothian had once been part of Northumbria, and its people continued to be seen as English long after it became Scottish territory. The kingdom as it existed by the end of Edgar's reign was less the product of a grand master plan than the result of evolving circumstances, chance, and political negotiation. Throughout the 10th century, Alfred's descendants managed to consolidate their power over a large and diverse area, resembling what we now call England. In doing so, they also projected authority over other British kingdoms. Kings like Aethelstan and Edgar claimed not only to be rulers of the English, but of all Britain, adopting titles such as Emperor or Basileus in their official documents. Whether or not these titles reflected real power over the entire island, they certainly signaled ambition. These kings sometimes extracted tribute from other British rulers and forced them to participate in royal councils or support military campaigns. At the same time, the Anglo-Saxon monarchy forged connections with powerful families on the continent. As the Carolingian Empire fragmented, rising dynasties looked to secure legitimacy through marriage into the long-established royal house of Wessex. In addition to these alliances, Anglo-Saxon kings also became directly involved in continental politics. Aethelstan, for instance, supported his nephew Louis IV in claiming the throne of West Francia and provided him with military backing. The ceremonial high point of 10th century royal power came with the coronation of King Edgar and Queen Elfthryth at Bath in 973. Though Edgar had become king in 959, the reasons for the long delay before his formal consecration are not entirely clear. During the ceremony, Edgar was proclaimed as ruler over all the kings of Britain. The choice of Bath, with its Roman associations, was deliberate, enhancing the symbolism of imperial authority. Following the coronation, Edgar met with his subordinate rulers at Chester. In a striking ritual, they rode him on the River Dee while he held the helm, a clear image of his leadership over the entire realm. By the 10th century, the nature of kingship had shifted significantly. Rulers no longer merely claimed larger territories. They now had to manage relationships with a wide range of regional elites and foreign leaders. The challenge of maintaining unity in a kingdom that stretched from the Scottish borders to the southern coast of England became increasingly complex. Building and maintaining loyalty across such distances and cultural divisions required new forms of governance. Earlier wars against the Danelaw had helped unify the nobility of Wessex and Mercia by providing common enemies and shared goals, along with the promise of rewards for loyal service. But once these military campaigns ended, kings had to find other ways to maintain control and legitimacy. Even before the full conquest of Northumbria, Anglo-Saxon rulers had begun the work of reforming and standardizing governance across their territories. Their aim was to create greater administrative consistency and to assert royal authority at a local level. A key part of this transformation was the increasing use of law as a tool for royal governance. While King Alfred had revived the tradition of issuing law codes in the late 9th century, it was during the 10th century that this practice became far more widespread. Issuing laws became a routine, if not regular, part of royal rule, and a vital way for kings to communicate with their subjects. The role of legal codes had changed too. In earlier periods, law codes were simpler and less comprehensive. By contrast, 10th century laws came in many forms, aimed at different audiences and serving a variety of purposes. Some were direct instructions to royal officials, others were responses from local communities to royal decrees, and some were broad proclamations issued in reaction to crises or to advance specific political agendas. These texts allowed the king and his advisors to engage in dialogue with their people, to negotiate solutions, to assert their authority, and to establish consensus. Ethelstan's reign offers particularly clear examples of this evolving legal culture. The code known as the Second Aethelstan, issued after a royal council at Greatley, addressed a broad range of topics: how justice should be administered, how thieves should be caught, how the ordeal should function, and even how livestock and coinage were to be handled. Later, after hearing that the peace had not been maintained, Ethelstan responded with another decree issued at Exeter, Vi Ethelstan, which included new measures and even proposed amnesties for certain wrongdoers. Still later, a council at Thundersfield responded to continued disorder by introducing harsh penalties for theft, including the death sentence, 4th Ethelstan. These changing laws reveal a government learning through trial and error. The king and his advisors were not merely issuing commands from above, but were actively assessing their effectiveness and adjusting them as needed. Significantly, the voices of local communities also appear in the legal record. The text known as Third Ethelstan is presented as a formal reply from the people of Kent to the king's decrees. They express gratitude for his efforts, confirm their agreement with certain policies, and offer their own interpretations of the laws. The document closes with a humble request that the king amend their response as he sees fit, pledging their willingness to follow whatever further instructions he might give. This kind of exchange shows how royal authority was reinforced through collaboration and consent, as much as through force. The legal code known as 6 Ethelstan begins by outlining the arrangements made by the London Peace Guild to maintain order, adding to earlier royal declarations made at Greatley, Exeter, and Thundersfield. It also reflects how Ethelstan later revised some of his own decisions, including a notable change made at Whittlebury, where he limited the use of the death penalty to those above the age of 15. These developments reveal how legal practice in this period was shaped by discussion, flexibility, and compromise. Alongside this, the 10th century legal texts shed light on the creation of key institutions that allowed royal governance to take shape. By the end of King Edgar's reign, the most important of these were the Shire and the Hundred, known as the wapentake in regions influenced by Danish custom. These were not just geographic boundaries, but also communities of people, meeting places, and courts of law. The Hundred functioned as a subdivision of the Shire and could vary significantly in size. Some covered as little as 67 square kilometers, while others spanned up to 168. In areas like the Midlands, they roughly matched the size of 100 hides of land, while in other regions, especially in southern Wessex, a single hundred might consist of just a handful of villages. A text called the Hundred Ordinance, written during the reign of King Edmund, or perhaps early in Edgar's rule, provides detailed information about how these hundreds operated. According to the ordinance, the Hundred Court was supposed to meet every 4 weeks to hear legal cases. Anyone who failed to attend was fined, and repeated refusal to comply with court decisions could result in harsher penalties, culminating in the loss of property and exile. The Hundred was also responsible for witnessing legal transactions and for organizing the pursuit of criminals. If a pursuit crossed into a neighboring hundred, the local official there was required to assist in the chase. There is still debate about what the appearance of the Hundred in these texts really signifies. Some features of the system can be found in earlier laws. For example, Alfred's Code refers to public gatherings overseen by royal officials, and laws from Edward's reign mention monthly meetings, just like in the Hundred Ordinance. Additionally, the practices of the London Peace Guild, as described in Book 6, Ethelstan, share several features with those found in the Hundred Courts. The locations where these courts met often reveal deep historical roots. They were usually set at prominent or meaningful sites: ancient roadways, burial mounds, notable stones, trees, or crossroads. Some of these places may have had ritual or administrative significance going back to prehistory. For instance, the Guthlaxton wapentake was named after a stone thought to be a Roman milestone near the Fossway. Sometimes entirely new mounds were constructed for this purpose. The mound associated with Seklo 100 dates from after the Roman period. Even if many parts of the Hundred system were already in use by the mid-10th century, the Hundred Ordinance marks a shift in how these practices were officially controlled and structured. It illustrates a growing effort by the Crown to regulate and define local administration more directly. Above the Hundred was the Shire, a territorial unit that first appears in surviving records from the time of King Ine of Wessex. Back then, it was associated with the authority of a senior noble called an ealdorman, and already had some connection to legal oversight. In the late 8th and 9th centuries, however, references to shires mainly appear in military contexts, with ealdormen leading their region's forces against external threats like Viking armies. By the 10th century, law codes began to refer to shires more consistently as both territorial and administrative entities. For example, Ethelstan instructed that royal officials obtain oaths of loyalty from people within their own shires, showing that such areas were recognized as distinct units of governance. This marked the beginning of a transition in which the role of the ealdorman was gradually supplanted by royal officials known as shire reeves, an office that would eventually evolve into the modern position of sheriff. Although ealdormen had long been associated with legal functions, it was only during Edgar's reign that the first clear reference appears to a shire court jointly presided over by an ealdorman and a bishop. A legal code issued at Andover in the early 960s ordered that these courts meet twice a year and that both church and secular law be explained to those in attendance. When and how Mercia and the Midlands were divided into shires remains uncertain. Shires outside of Wessex are first clearly mentioned only towards the end of the 10th century. In these regions, shires were typically named after fortified towns, or burhs, such as Chester giving its name to Cheshire, or Stafford to Staffordshire. One puzzling omission is Tamworth, an important royal centre in earlier Mercian history. Its absence from the shire system, and the fact that its territory was split between two shires, might suggest that King Edward the Elder deliberately reorganized these areas to weaken older power structures and reinforce his own authority. This reorganization may also relate to a document known as the Burgel Heidage, which details defensive arrangements probably made during Edward's reign. Still, with no clear evidence, scholars continue to debate when these administrative changes took place, and they could belong to any period within the 10th century. Systems like the hundred and the shire gave Anglo-Saxon kings tools for ruling more effectively. But these tools only worked if there was support from local elites, officials, and communities. The strength of royal power in this period often depended on a partnership between centralized authority and regional influence. This cooperation was the foundation of governance in late Anglo-Saxon England. Kings had many ways to build loyalty among the nobility, but one of the most important was through the court, which served as a hub of patronage and validation. Monarchs could grant land, wealth, and official positions to those who supported them, while also confirming and legitimizing power that nobles already held. Being present at court, or even just being close to the king, was a source of immense prestige, and was something both guarded by the ruler and proudly displayed by those who received such access. Written accounts also highlight the role of royal feasts and ceremonies in strengthening the bonds between the king and his leading subjects. These events helped promote a shared sense of identity and loyalty to the crown. Because the court often remained in the heart of Wessex, nobles from distant regions had to travel far to attend, reinforcing the central authority of the king and exposing regional elites to one another. These gatherings provided a space where local identities could be softened and where national unity could begin to form. Such events also offered occasions for elaborate displays of rank and ritual, such as the symbolic wearing of the crown, first recorded during the reign of King Edgar. During the 10th century, certain noble families rose to considerable power, holding important titles across multiple reigns and exerting significant influence over royal governance. One of the most prominent of these families was that of Ethelstan, known as Half-King, a title that reflected the scale of his authority. Between 932 and 957, he served as ealdorman of East Anglia, though his reach extended across the eastern Danelaw. He was succeeded by his son Ethelwine, and his brothers Edric and Ethelwold also held positions of power in the 940s. His father, Ethelfrith, had held authority in southern Mercia earlier in the century. Æthelstan's standing was further reinforced by his role as foster father to King Edgar and as advisor to Kings Edmund and Edred. Despite his jurisdiction being centered in East Anglia, Æthelstan also held estates in Somerset and Devon and supported Glastonbury Abbey, where he eventually retired as a monk. His ties to Wessex and possible kinship with the ruling dynasty likely made him a trusted figure to whom the crown could safely delegate power in the Danelaw. Alternatively, his family may have already been influential in the region and was strategically embraced by the West Saxon rulers. Either way, the wide distribution of Æthelstan's estates and those of other leading nobles played a key role in unifying the newly expanded kingdom and may reflect intentional royal policy. The 10th century marked a major evolution in how England was governed. Though change unfolded gradually throughout the century, the reign of King Edgar appears to have marked a critical moment in consolidating royal authority and administrative reach. The hundred system, while emerging earlier, only reached its full form by the mid-10th century. Shires had existed in parts of the kingdom for some time, but it was under Edgar that the operation of shire courts became clearly documented in legal codes and records of legal disputes. Edgar's most striking administrative reform came later in his reign with a complete overhaul of the kingdom's coinage. This reform introduced a single standardized design for coins throughout England, managed by a central authority. The number of active mints was expanded, and future kings would periodically recall and replace old coins with new designs, possibly every 6 years. Though these recoinings likely never covered all coins in circulation. While aspects of this system had earlier roots, Æthelstan's legislation at Greatley had already called for a uniform coinage within Wessex. It was Edgar who extended this policy across the entire realm. By the close of Edgar's reign, the machinery of government in Anglo-Saxon England had become highly developed and capable of carrying out complex administrative tasks. Some historians, such as James Campbell, have even gone so far as to describe it as a true state, or even a nation-state. Whether such ideas would have made sense to people at the time is debatable. Moreover, the historical record we rely on tends to reflect the views and aspirations of those at the center of power, royal scribes and churchmen with close ties to the court. As such, these texts often reveal royal intentions more than the practical realities of governance. They may gloss over the local variations and informal arrangements that defined the daily functioning of law and administration in many parts of the kingdom. Still, the very fact that late Anglo-Saxon England can be discussed in terms of statehood says much about the profound transformations of the era. Even if the power of rulers like Edgar never quite matched the idealized image portrayed in the sources, there can be little doubt that the 10th century brought lasting and significant changes to the relationship between kings and their subjects. In the year 964, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reports that King Edgar removed the priests from several major churches, including both the Old and New Minsters in Winchester, as well as Chertsey and Milton, and replaced them with monks. According to later accounts, Edgar sent a man named Wulfstan of Dalham to carry out the expulsion at the Old Minster, and the priests there were reportedly filled with fear. These events were part of a broader religious transformation known today as the Benedictine Reforms, which reached their height during Edgar's reign. The goal of these reforms was to replace communities of secular clerics with monks living under the rule associated with Saint Benedict of Nursia. The leaders of this movement were 3 influential churchmen: Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury, Ethelwold, Bishop of Winchester, and Oswald, who served as Bishop of Worcester and later as Archbishop of York. They were inspired by monastic centers on the continent, such as Cluny, Fleury, and Gorze, and their readings of historical texts like Bede's Ecclesiastical History led them to view the early Anglo-Saxon church as having once been dominated by strong monastic communities. Over time, they believed, these monasteries had declined, being taken over by clerics who owned property and sometimes had families, and whose houses were often controlled by secular lords who misused their resources. The narrative of these reforms is largely shaped by later texts written in the 10th and 11th centuries, which reflect the outlook of the reformers. Ethelwold himself authored works explaining the rationale behind the changes, but most of what is known about the movement comes from later biographies. Chief among them are the lives of Ethelwold, Dunstan, and Oswald, written by authors such as Wulfstan Cantor and Byrhtferth of Ramsey. These texts were composed during a period when England was once again facing Viking threats, and they often portrayed Edgar's reign as a lost golden age. As a result, the lives of these reformers tend to exaggerate their impact and draw sharp contrasts between the supposed corruption of the past and the purity of the Reformed Church. Because the historical record is so heavily influenced by reform-minded authors, it is difficult to determine how much monastic life had actually survived into the 10th century. The destruction caused by Viking raids and Scandinavian settlement likely contributed to a significant decline in monasticism by the late 8th and 9th centuries. Although King Alfred founded some religious houses, such as the monastery at Athelney, most institutions during the late 9th and early 10th centuries were clerical in nature. Even so, some evidence suggests that monastic traditions persisted. Byrhtferth's claim that there were no monks or monasteries in England by the 940s is contradicted by his own writing. Some religious houses still had monks, and leading churchmen like Bishop Cenwalд and Archbishop Oda were themselves professed monks. Oda's tonsured appearance, which earned him the nickname the Bald, may further support this. The revival of monasticism that would culminate in the Benedictine reforms appears to have begun during the reign of King Ethelstan. He was renowned for his devotion, amassing sacred relics and creating a notable library. Some of his books, like the MacDurnan Gospels, were donated to religious institutions. Ethelstan's court was a hub of scholarship, attracting figures from across Britain, Ireland, and the continent, including the distinguished Israel, the grammarian, a scholar of Greek, and various Irish and Breton intellectuals. English bishops such as Cenwalд also traveled extensively in Europe, visiting monasteries in areas like modern Germany and Switzerland. These journeys exposed them to developments in continental monasticism, including efforts to revive the Benedictine tradition. One of the major centers of this movement was Fleury, with which Archbishop Oda of Canterbury was closely connected. He may have even taken vows there. Oda's name appears in the records of religious communities such as St. Gallen and Fafers, further indicating his links to continental reformers. Oda left behind a number of writings, including a set of guidelines known as the Constitutions, which emphasized the importance of prayer, study, and monastic stability. He was also involved in drafting King Edmund's first legal code, which addressed religious matters like clerical celibacy. Around 948, Oda commissioned a poem celebrating the translation of St. Wilfrid's relics to Canterbury, reflecting his admiration for earlier monastic traditions in Northumbria. Although Oda's work had a significant influence on the later Benedictine movement, his nephew Oswald became a major reformer. It would be misleading to see him as entirely aligned with the later program. His reforms were broader and more accommodating of the existing religious landscape, showing a willingness to work with the structures already in place. By the 930s and 940s, a number of English churchmen had become committed to monastic ideals, had ties to the continent, and held positions of influence at court. Figures like Dunstan and Ethelwold likely encountered reformist ideas during their time in royal service. Dunstan's appointment as abbot of Glastonbury by King Edmund is often seen as the formal beginning of the reforms, though the situation is more complex. Dunstan had personal ties to Glastonbury and received his early religious education there. His biographer even describes a childhood vision of the monastery he would someday build. Still, the actual nature of the Glastonbury community under Dunstan remains uncertain. His biographer claims he administered it according to Benedictine principles, but does not clearly state that he enforced strict observance. While Dunstan undoubtedly supported monasticism, Ethelwold joined the community under his guidance. His approach may have resembled that of Oda more than the stricter practices of later years. Ethelwold eventually left Glastonbury in search of deeper religious education. He hoped to travel abroad for further training, but King Edred, influenced by his mother Eadgifu, denied him permission. Instead, Ethelwold was granted control of Abingdon, a former monastery that had fallen into lay hands. There, he re-established monastic life, drawing on men from Glastonbury and other centers. He became abbot and received generous support from Eadred and Eadgifu. Although Ethelwold never went abroad himself, in the late 950s he sent a monk named Osgar to Fleury to study the Benedictine rule and teach it upon his return. Oswald was sent to the monastery of Fleury by his uncle, Archbishop Oda, most likely in the late 940 or early 950, possibly at the same time as Osgar. During his time there, Oswald took monastic vows and, as later recorded by Bertfurth, committed the entire liturgy to memory so that he could pass it on after returning to England. Dunstan, too, encountered continental monastic reform, though under different circumstances. He was exiled from England in 956 by King Edwig, reportedly after intervening to separate the young king from a woman named Elfgifu during his coronation. While this account emphasizes a moral cause, it likely reflects deeper political tensions at court. Notably, Edwig's marriage to Elfgifu was later annulled by Oda on the grounds of close kinship. Dunstan's exile took him to Flanders, where he stayed at the monastery of St. Peter's in Ghent. This monastery had recently adopted Benedictine practices under the guidance of Gerhard of Brogne. When Edgar rose to power as king over the Mercians and Northumbrians, he recalled Dunstan and appointed him first to Worcester and then to London, possibly holding both sees at once. By the end of 959, Edgar named Dunstan Archbishop of Canterbury. Edgar's reign marked the peak of the Benedictine reform movement in England. He was deeply committed to the reformers' ideals and features prominently in the texts they produced. Alongside Dunstan at Canterbury, Oswald became Bishop of Worcester in 961 and later Archbishop of York in 971, serving in both roles simultaneously. Ethelwold was named Bishop of Winchester in 963. During Edgar's rule, numerous monasteries were founded or restructured according to Benedictine principles. Ethelwold established or revitalized monasteries in East Anglia, including Medhamstede, Peterborough, Thorney, and Ely. Oswald was responsible for founding religious houses at Westbury-on-Trim, Ramsey within his cathedral precinct in Worcester, and at Winchcombe. Although Dunstan's role in founding monasteries is harder to trace, later sources suggest that he removed clerics from Malmesbury, and appointed Wulfsig as Abbot of St. Peter's in Westminster. Despite their shared goals, the leading reformers had differing views on how these changes should be implemented. Ethelwold, with Edgar's strong backing, took the most aggressive approach. In 964, he oversaw the removal of clerics from both the new and old minsters in Winchester, replacing them with monks from Abingdon. Edgar had sought papal approval for this action the year before, and he dispatched Wulfstan of Dalham to ensure the plan was carried out. While contemporary records describe these removals as swift, the process at the new minster, in particular, seems to have unfolded more slowly. A detailed royal charter issued in 966 formally re-established the new minster and outlined the privileges granted to it by Edgar. The charter, likely written by Ethelwold, included a long preface condemning the previous clerical occupants and offering a detailed account of the expected conduct for the new monastic residents. The delay between the removals and the issuance of this charter, along with its defensive tone, suggests that the reforms faced resistance
mercy and
and required continued justification even 2 years later. Ethelwold's more forceful strategy was not mirrored by Oswald or Dunstan. Both preferred gradual reform. At Worcester, Oswald carefully recorded his control over the lands of the diocese, and his efforts can be traced in surviving documents. Over 70 land leases made under his authority between 963 and 991 have been preserved, illustrating his patient and methodical approach to monastic transformation. The witness lists attached to the land leases made under Oswald show no signs of abrupt personnel changes that would suggest a mass expulsion like the one led by Ethelwold at the new minster. Although a few individuals are identified as monks, clerics continued to be part of the cathedral community. Interestingly, at least one lease was granted to a monk, which indicates that the principle of communal ownership had not yet fully taken root in Worcester. Over time, however, there was a shift in preference for those who had taken monastic vows, especially for leadership roles such as dean. Instead of forcibly removing clerics, Oswald created a new monastic house, St. Mary's, within the cathedral grounds, allowing both communities to coexist. At Canterbury, the records are less clear, but Dunstan also appears to have pursued a more measured path, as the cathedral became fully monastic only by the early 11th century. These contrasting strategies may reflect the reformers' different encounters with continental monasticism. On the continent, reforms following the rule of Saint Benedict did not typically involve cathedrals or bishoprics, but focused exclusively on monasteries. Dunstan and Oswald likely adopted this model. In contrast, Ethelwold, although influenced by continental developments through figures like Osgar, may have drawn more deeply from Anglo-Saxon tradition. His writings reveal a strong engagement with Bede's ecclesiastical history, from which he may have envisioned a church led by monk bishops like Augustine, Aidan, or Cuthbert, with monastic communities governed by poverty and communal discipline. By the mid-1970s, a significant number of English religious houses had embraced Benedictine principles. Still, the rule of Saint Benedict, originally crafted for a large, self-sustaining monastery in rural Italy, did not provide a complete framework for all monastic life in England. As a result, different monasteries interpreted the rule in diverse ways. This lack of uniformity clashed with the reformers' vision of a cohesive and consistent monastic system. To address this, King Edgar convened a council at Winchester in the early 970s to establish a standard monastic guidebook for England. The document issued by this council became known as the Regularis Concordia. Likely composed by Ethelwold, It laid out the reformers' shared goals and their model for religious life. The text opens with a lament for the decline of monasteries, blaming this on negligent clerics and asserting Edgar's commitment to their restoration. It describes how the council consulted continental houses such as Fleury and St. Peter's at Ghent and combined their insights with local traditions to produce the new monastic code. Though the Regularis Concordia reflects significant continental influence and shares similarities with early customaries from Fleury, its vision was uniquely Anglo-Saxon. It placed the king at the heart of monastic reform, portraying him as the primary guardian and benefactor of monastic communities, with the queen playing a similar role for female houses. The document also drew upon native English texts, such as Bede's writings, and mandated that monasteries should offer prayers for the king, an idea echoed in earlier English church councils. Texts like the Regularis Concordia painted the Benedictine reforms as a profound transformation of English religious life. While their cultural and political importance is undeniable, it is difficult to measure their practical impact. Nevertheless, some Reformed monasteries grew into the wealthiest and most influential institutions of the late Anglo-Saxon period, retaining their power even after the Norman conquest. The reforms also reshaped the urban environment in places like Winchester. To create enclosed monastic precincts around the New Minster, Old Minster, and Nunnaminster, walls and hedges were erected, and watercourses were diverted to serve the needs of the monks. By the century's end, this construction had effectively sealed off southeastern Winchester from lay access, and several residential buildings had been cleared to make way for monastic development. In terms of culture and education, the Benedictine reforms had a lasting impact. Ethelwold, in particular, championed the use of the English language to educate those unfamiliar with Latin. His school at Winchester played a key role in developing a standardized form of Old English, using a carefully selected vocabulary. As a result, much of the surviving Old English literature was composed by his pupils or their intellectual descendants, and written in this refined literary style, leaving a powerful legacy that extended well beyond the 10th century. The reformers of the 10th century also promoted a distinct form of Latin writing known as the hermeneutic style. This approach was marked by its deliberately scholarly and obscure vocabulary, often borrowing words of Greek origin or inventing new terms, while employing a complex and often tangled sentence structure. This stylistic choice became the dominant form of Latin composition in England during the later 10th and 11th centuries. Alongside their literary efforts, the reformers developed a unique artistic tradition in manuscript decoration known as the Winchester style. Inspired by earlier Carolingian models, this style featured elaborate vegetal and acanthus leaf designs, stylized and elongated human figures, and flowing drapery. Some of the earliest surviving examples are found in St. Dunstan's class book, with its full expression seen in works like the Leofric Missal and the richly decorated Benedictional of St. Ethelwold. The Winchester style went on to influence other media, including sculpture, mural painting, and metalwork. Despite these significant contributions, the wider impact of the reforms was uneven. Even though Oswald held the position of Archbishop of York, there is scant evidence of similar reform efforts in the north. Notable northern monastic sites like Jarrow and Hexham, which held deep historical and symbolic value, were not revived as part of the movement. Although Oswald is said to have restored Ripon and moved the relics of Wilfrid and other early abbots into new shrines, there is no indication that a new monastic community was established there. This absence of reform activity may reflect the strong dependence of the reformers on royal backing, particularly that of King Edgar. Without the firm support of the king, especially in politically unstable regions like the North, large-scale reforms, such as the removal of secular clergy, may have been unfeasible. Overall, the Benedictine reforms appear to have been closely tied to the royal court, with the most influential figures deeply integrated into royal circles and their most concentrated efforts centered in Winchester. While the Benedictine reforms were clearly transformative for the Church, other developments during the 10th century ultimately had a broader and more lasting influence on English society. Both documentary and archaeological evidence reveal a surge in church construction during this period. While some of this involved the building or expansion of major institutions like Christ Church in Canterbury or Westminster Abbey, the vast majority of activity came from lesser nobles and landowners who founded small churches on their estates. As larger estates were divided into smaller holdings, these emerging landholders saw church building as a way to assert and legitimize their social status. Over time, these small estate churches became the foundation of the parish system in medieval England. This growing network of local churches began to reshape the delivery of pastoral care, often overlapping with or even challenging the authority of older religious institutions. Before the Viking Age, there were already references to various payments and dues owed to the church for religious services. In the 10th century, these local and informal arrangements were gradually brought under royal regulation. Prior to Edgar's reign, laws did not clearly specify where such dues should be directed. For instance, Aethelstan merely stated that church dues and payments for the souls of the dead should be made to the proper places, without naming them. Edgar's laws, however, issued at Andover, specified that tithes should go to established long-standing churches unless a nobleman owned an estate with a church and graveyard, in which case 1/3 of the tithe could be retained locally. If the estate church lacked a graveyard, the full tithe went to the old church, and the landowner was expected to fund the local church from the remaining portion of his income. By the early 11th century, a more elaborate church hierarchy had taken shape. King Ethelred II issued laws that distinguished between different kinds of churches, including chief minsters, smaller minsters, and field churches. These older churches, like the ones mentioned in Edgar's laws, often originated as large monastic foundations tasked with ministering to wide geographic areas. Many of these mother churches maintained their influence long after the Norman conquest, but the rise of local churches had already begun to shift the balance. Wealthy patrons increasingly supported their own churches, redirecting tithes and offerings away from the older institutions in favor of new, more localized communities. Just as the system of hundreds and shires had become established during Edgar's reign, this new structure of pastoral care eventually solidified into a lasting model. Over time, it helped shape not only the ecclesiastical framework of the Middle Ages, but also the structures of early modern and modern England. The institutions and systems that emerged in the 10th century proved remarkably durable. However, in the following century, the political stability of the Anglo-Saxon realm would face serious strain. Renewed Viking invasions and internal power struggles would bring an end to the dominance of the House of Wessex, marking the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter in English history.